Excellencies, distinguished members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, in my capacity as chair of the Counter-Terrorism Committee, I welcome you all to the technical session of the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate on preventing terrorists from exploiting the internet and social media to recruit terrorists and incite terrorist acts while respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Terrorist groups, as we all have seen, are very highly adept at utilizing information and communications technologies, or ICT, to facilitate their full range of activities, including incitement, radicalization, recruitment, training, planning, collection of information, communication, preparation, financing, and execution of attacks. These technologies have undoubtedly played a role in enabling ISIL to become one of the largest, richest, and most dangerous terrorist organizations in modern history. There is a strong political consensus on the need to counter the use of ICT for terrorist purposes. The Security Council, in its resolution 1373, 1624, 2178, as well as numerous presidential statements, call upon all member states to undertake certain measures to prohibit and prevent terrorist exploitation of these technologies, including for the purpose of incitement to commit a terrorist act or acts, and to act cooperatively in their efforts to do so while respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, and in compliance with other obligations under international law. However, translating this political will into effective international response to this threat has proven to be quite challenging. In cases where criminal or law enforcement measures are not appropriate or possible, the most effective response to objectionable content published by terrorists and their supporters may be to disseminate our own narratives, counter-narratives, and counter-messages. We must become more effective at this. Although some governments have been successful in advancing their own counter-narratives, the credibility and knowledge of members of civil society, including former violent extremists, victims of terrorism, youth groups, religious leaders, and women, can be very persuasive. It is crucial that all stakeholders come together to face this threat. I'm therefore particularly glad that we have many expert representatives of both the private sector and civil society here with us today. Today's discussions and tomorrow's special meeting provide a very timely opportunity to discuss recent technological advances, good practices, and effective measures taken in this area. Bringing individuals to justice for their use of ICT for terrorist purposes is an important tool for deterring and disrupting their activities. Our efforts to build effective international legal frameworks for investigating and prosecuting such offences face significant obstacles. There are gaps in domestic laws for dealing with ICT-related offences. Effective international cooperation is also complicated by the double criminality issue, jurisdiction limitations for offences occurring in several locations, a lack of common rules enabling access to evidence, and challenges relating to the anonymity provided by the ICT. Even though intelligence and law enforcement agencies have enjoyed some success in identifying, disrupting, and investigating terrorist activities online, a more holistic approach that transcends traditional law enforcement methods is required. In addition to strengthening their cooperation with other member states, member states should also strengthen their cooperation with relevant international and regional organizations, civil society, and the private sector. ICT resources are to a large extent privately owned. Social media firms, telecommunication companies, email service providers, and providers of website and data hosting services are all integral partners in a global ICT infrastructure. Tomorrow, participants in a special meeting will recommend a set of strategies to guide states in their efforts to prevent terrorists from exploiting the internet and social media to recruit terrorists and incite terrorist acts while also respecting and advancing human rights and fundamental freedoms. We shall use the outcome of today's technical sessions to guide them in their work. I therefore look forward to a focused and productive discussion. Once again, thank you all for being here today and for your willingness to share your expertise.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone.
Je vais parler en français.
I'm going to speak in French. distinguished ambassadors, dear colleagues. With the matter of preventing terrorists from exploiting the internet and social media to recruit terrorists and incite to terrorist acts, we have a problem here which truly concerns, I would say, all countries. All we have to do is to look at the very regrettable incidents that have taken place in San Bernardino to see how the impact of radicalization via the internet and recruitment via the internet, the impact that that can have in the daily lives of everyone, including people in this country, but also in every country around the world. The first thing that we have to underscore is that no country in the world is immune or protected from a swift radicalization via the internet, rapid recruitment via the internet, and incitement to commit terrorist acts via the internet. No country is protected from this, and that is why the UN does have a role to play in this dialogue. And I'm very pleased that the CTC, the Counter-Terrorism Committee, has decided to hold a special meeting on this subject tomorrow, a meeting which we have to prepare today, and a meeting where we will have to discuss this topic. I would say that the issues that are raised are tremendous in scope. The first one is that of respecting human rights in the work that we have to carry out in order to fight against the use of the internet and social media by terrorists. It's very easy to say that, but it's very difficult to do, because among the human rights that we have to respect, we have to consider the right to life. It's very easy to say we have to respect human rights. Yes, we all have to respect and uphold human rights. Is it something impossible? No, it's our role. But that means that international cooperation is one of the most important elements when it comes to doing this work. But international cooperation seen at another level, a more practical level. As I said, very often terrorist organizations, in particular ISIL or Daesh, have an ability for flexibility, for speed, for fluidity that we do not have at all. And so we have to change our methods while respecting human rights, which I mentioned. And the change in method is the speed with which we will act. That means that, first of all, we have to begin by building trust. Trust at three levels. Between countries, among countries, and in particular the authorities that represent countries, but also with the private sector and with civil society, because there are also the rights that we have to respect, the integrity of business, but also the respect for private life and privacy. And we can't bring all of these elements together unless we work together. You know that in international organizations, we apply and produce treaties. Fine. Now, are treaties going to work? Not necessarily. There is, as I said, actors from companies that are not covered by treaties, or businesses that are not covered by treaties. And secondly, we have to face the number of messages. I'm taking, for example, in YouTube. I look at YouTube. There are YouTube videos of the last 2 years. There were 14 million YouTube videos produced with messages that are messages related to the promotion of terrorist activities or the incitement to terrorist activities. 14 million. In former life, I was a judge of the French court, but also a prosecutor. And I can tell you that I cannot deal with 14 million messages, and so we have to make sure that private companies do their work as well. Now, how can we make sure that this work will be in sync with that of states? Well, there are a few slight common denominators or agreements or arrangements with platforms or templates which would allow state authorities as well as the private sector, but also civil society, to produce agreements together, agreements that we propose in the end. So we have to be very innovative, and I come back to my main question. We have to have innovative ideas. We have to have ideas that would break taboos. And for that, I think that today's meeting is exactly what we need. We have international organizations. We have, in particular, we've worked for about a year with many of them, but I'd like to mention the Council of Europe, because the Council of Europe allowed us to have a protocol against foreign terrorist fighters, which is a phenomenon which is linked to the use of the internet by the terrorists. And with that protocol, if we also set up 24/7 prosecutor groups, those are practical measures that would speed up our response. Our response must be fluid, must be swift. And I'd like to say a few words. The same fluidity, the same flexibility applies to other sectors in the fight against terrorism, such as the Security Council. We'll see that tomorrow with the financing of terrorism. And so we have to work, for example, on the three stages. If we work on incitement, incitement to commit terrorist acts, there are countries that cannot work on incitement as an end in itself. One of the largest countries in the world cannot do that. It has to be linked to a material act of complicity. But since we cannot absorb the entire production on the internet that glorifies terrorism, that's where we need arrangements, and very clear arrangements. There could be a basis from the private sector with alerts from civil society, and prosecutors could also work in a more specific way. For countries such as mine, we can work directly on the incitement to commit terrorist acts, but on very important cases, or when they're linked, and this is the case to San Bernardino, when they're linked to a terrorist act, there is no problem, because that was an act of complicity. And so we have to bear in mind mechanisms, flexible mechanisms, and bring together all of the different types of experience. So you're here to exchange today your experience, and thanks to my colleagues from CTED who are here, I would like that exchange of experiences to bring us perhaps not to best practices, Madam Chairman, but there are real good practices when it comes to a complete message, and also on the matter of when should we bring someone to justice, on the question of this link between the public and private sector, the distribution of tasks with civilian society. That's what we have to do. And if we do that, then we will truly manage to find solutions to fight not terrorism as a whole, but to fight terrorist acts that we are familiar with at the UN, because We have 18 protocols and conventions that allow us to be familiar with them. We can fight them, but we also have to remember that there's a great deal of work to be done in terms of prevention, but that's something else. We'll talk about that another day. There's counter-messaging that we have to work on very clearly. All of that in the framework of our international cooperation, where once again, we have to cooperate. We don't have a choice. We don't have a choice because we are all, unfortunately, all the countries and every citizen, we're all potential victims of terrorism, like those victims of terrorism. I keep bringing it up, but those victims who are more numerous in Muslim countries where, unfortunately, those terrorists sometimes find very fertile ground, and without necessarily being linked to the Muslim religion. And so that means that we have to work together. We have to have a clear vision. And I'd like to thank all of the speakers in advance for helping us together find rapid and specific solutions in order to fight this scourge, which is now propaganda conducted by terrorists to recruit their foreign terrorist fighters. Unfortunately, thanks to this wonderful media, the communication media, this media that also has to protect us so that we can continue to communicate. The media made up of the internet and social media. Thank you very much.
C'est à moi? Ok. Bien. Hassan, est-ce que tu as quelque chose à dire? C'est toi qui prends le relais? Qui prend le relais? We move to the session 1 now. So we will move to the session 1 now, and I will call the participant, the panelist of the session 1, to come here and to start the first session.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, during this session, we will focus on current
Microphone, please.
use of the internet and the social media. Sorry, let me start again. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this session will focus on the current threats and challenges posed by the use of the internet and social media for the purposes of radicalization, for incitement to terrorism, for training to conduct terrorist attacks, recruitment and travel assistance to forest terrorist fighters, and coordinating planning and financing of terrorist activities. We have before us a mixed group of experts and panelists to provide updates on these challenges, which should thereafter pave way for a well-informed and interesting discussion with all of you. In order to allow us as much time as possible for that discussion, I would request the panelists to please limit their presentations to 8 minutes. I will certainly intervene if I believe we are going to be breaching that mark. It will be followed by an open discussion. I would request all of you to restrict your interventions to 2 minutes. And again, I will gently intervene if I find that some of you are crossing that mark. There is a good chance that all of you may not be able to present your views. Please note that your statements and ideas can be uploaded on the CTED website. With that, let me very quickly move to our first panelist, Mr. Matthew Miraglia, who is the Supervisory Special Agent with the FBI. Mr. Miraglia, you have the floor for 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everybody here. I'll try to keep it brief to keep time for the question and answer period. But when we talk about the terrorist use of the internet and their recruitment, their use of social media, mobile messaging applications, we kind of have to remember who we're talking about here. A lot of times, most of the time, it's not people in their 40s, it's not people in their 50s, it's teenagers, it's people in their early 20s who are always historically going to be on the cutting edge of new technologies. So we look at it and we wonder, why are they so good at this? Why have they adapted to this so quickly? It's because that's what young people do. They adapt to new technologies. They're the early adopters of all new technology. And this generation in particular, this is how they communicate. To people on this panel who've used the phone, who used email, people now, the young people in ISIS, everywhere that they are, use social media as their main method of communication. It shouldn't surprise us that they're good at it. It shouldn't surprise us that they know how to use it. So now, what ISIS has been able to do is, in essence, create sort of a mini UN in Syria. All of us are here together. They have a smaller version of this in Raqqa, wherever they are. And these people that have come to there have brought, the same way we've all brought, the communication mechanisms that they used back at home. They've brought it now to ISIS, to Syria. So they have now, in a matter of a year, created a vast global network that they can communicate with everyone that shares their views on the planet. So from a law enforcement perspective, where we used to only be worried about a geographic region and the tools they would use in that region, we now have to worry about every single tool that someone would use on the planet. So someone from Europe might use a different communication mechanism than someone from the Americas, than someone from Asia. So now where I used to be able to focus on one piece of equipment, I have to focus on all of them. So one of the solutions is going to have to be better cooperation between different nations, different corporations where they are, to be able to have us understand these tools. I don't have time to understand every tool on the internet. Not everyone in ISIS understands every social media tool on the internet. That's just not the way it operates. They have specialists. We're going to have the same thing. So as these tools move, the terrorists are able to move quickly with them. The private sector creates a tool. ISIS is on it almost immediately, quicker than we are, quicker than everyone else is, because they're there living it, utilizing it. So now we identify a tool, and in following our laws, we will then go broach a corporation to say, hey, we need your help with this. We're going to hear a lot about we need private sector cooperation, and we do. But we have to remember what private sector cooperation entails is not we show up, you give us everything you have. It's we show up with in the United States, a valid court order, a search warrant, and we ask you to help us. Say, help us get the information that we need. With encryption, with other tools, we're not going to be able to do it on our own. 20 years ago, maybe there were a handful of nations that had the encryption capabilities that are now in the pocket of everyone in this room on their smartphones. So we're going to need help from the corporations. It doesn't mean we come in and take everything you have. It doesn't mean you just give us everything without question. It means you help us. You help us understand what they're doing, how they're using it, and then you help us to figure out what's happening. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to take down every social media application, every mobile messaging application around the world. And if we did, they'd just move to something that none of us know about, and then we'd really be in the dark on what they're doing. So helping each other, having corporations help the various governments represented here is going to be key in that. And also, we have to remember that while we do want technical solutions to these problems, we do want to be able to decrypt these things, we do want to be able to stop them in some situations, a lot of times we want it to continue. In law enforcement, it gives us leads. It tells us where we can look, where we need to look, who we need to look at. So we are going to have to embrace it as well. The open nature of the internet is going to cut both ways. It's going to allow them to communicate, but then that communication is out where we can see it. The worst thing that we could do would be to have them pass messages face-to-face in Syria. Then there's almost no way for us to get that. So if they're going to communicate out in the open, utilizing the vast infrastructure that the whole world has created, that can benefit us, and we have to use it to our benefit and not to our disadvantage. And finally, just to make it short, with the technological advantages, we also have to remember that traditional law enforcement, traditional intelligence techniques are still going to be some of our best resources. We can't forget that confidential human sources, someone that's talking to a terrorist, is always going to be our best source of information. It's always going to be the most useful way to get information. So running sources, running undercover operations, these will always be an extremely important part of what we do, and we just have to learn how to mesh it now with the new technologies that are out there as they come up and as they're using them. So that will conclude my remarks to start.
Thank you, Matthews. I think you raised two important aspects on this particular conversation. One was the robust partnership that is now needed between private sector, within and across nations, on keeping up with the evolving encryption and multiple software tools that are being used by the actors, and certainly the need to keep investing in traditional law enforcement and how to mesh it with the new techniques. We will move to the second panelist, Mr. Timur Abregov, Senior Prosecutor from the Office of the Prosecutor General of Russia. Mr. Abregov, you have the floor for 8 minutes.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to share with you the experience of countering terrorism on the internet in the Russian Federation, and I'll try to deal with all the major aspects of this and perhaps some specifics I'll share with you. As we know, they broadly use communication capacities of the network in Russia with the international social media, Facebook, etc. They have a large number of pages in order to organize the financing of terrorism to finance their acts. Now, on such sites, besides propaganda, they also have means for recovering funds and for collecting funds. Now, faced with this phenomenon, our body dealing with this in the Russian Federation has changed the way the prosecutor works in terms of blocking internet sites if it does contain appeals to terrorist activities or to funding such terrorism or other means of assisting or ideological help, for example, to terrorists. Since February 2014, until these changes in the law, the prosecutor did block more than 400 websites which were linked with terrorist sites, including ISIL, and we blocked illegal information. This was done on our demand, and we do have a federal service for oversight of technology and mass communications. This is called Rusnadzor, and this controls internet resources and when necessary does block them, and it also controls the implementation of our laws under a Security Council resolution which calls upon member states to take proper measures to put an end to the terrorist use of websites, to bring into domestic law proper legislation in this regard, and also to provide technical and financial assistance to those states. Now, we should point out that in the Russian Federation in 2013, in the criminal code, we did change the laws with regard to the participation of Russian citizens in terrorist groups, and under other laws dealing with this. Now, with regard to the criminal code and the criminal acts under this category, we see that the participation of Russian citizens in illegal terrorist groups is directly linked to their recruitment through the internet, and it's particularly acute in terms of terrorist crimes, and we do use counter-terrorist measures to deal with this. Now, the basic means of dealing with this on the internet, we believe need to be improved, is the following. We need to block illegal information. This is quite new element of our law enforcement agencies. Gradually, this involves member states of the United Nations.
We must prevent citizens from, protect citizens from violent terrorist extremism. And we work with companies like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. They do not always block ISIL information. There are also cases when we put people on this list, they are not still not blocked, and this allows people to have access to this illegal information. Now, the reason for this could be a technical reason. We don't know what the reason is, but in any case, we are interested to have a reduction in the cases of where these companies do not block this information. Now, also the propaganda from ISIL, as was pointed out by the second report of the CTC, the use of these media does allow these criminals to make sure that they are not traceable. Now, most Russian language sites working in the interest of, for example, the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations are managed from Russian territory. This is clear. However, physically, in fact, they are located on servers such as Google and Twitter and Facebook, etc. Now, this makes it more difficult to attain data and protocols of the addresses of these users, these criminals. Currently, such information can be demanded through bilateral agreements with, for example, the American partners and other countries. However, this mechanism does require quite a long period of time, and unfortunately, the Internet is developing too quickly for us to wait. Now, on a unilateral basis, we can use our forces to deal with this problem. Now, we can exchange information with these internet companies, for example. Now, as we address this in the Russian Federation, we do have a special control service in ITC and communication. This is Rusnadzor, as I said before. Now, with this, the prosecutor's office can work with requests from foreign colleagues with regards to these sources of information from the Russian Federation. And we need to collect evidence, and this allows us to confirm the illegal nature of certain websites. Now, of course, this work, in our view, can be conducted only if there is mutual cooperation. We also need to deal with this in the broader context of exchange of information. Now, this is not fundamentally new. There are a number of problems on the exchange of information, which are referred to in the second report of the CTC. Now, in other words, we block one site, for example. Now, the criminal in another country sets up 3 other sites. Therefore, it's important to find out the source of this information and bring our work up to a new level. Now, if there wasn't cooperation dealing with these social sites would not be as effective in the hands of terrorists. Now, we would like to express the hope that we, together with our pooled resources, we can resolve this problem and deal with and combat terrorism on the websites. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Abregov. You again stressed on the need for mutual cooperation between nations, exchange of information, and the dilemma of responding to illegal websites being used by terrorist organizations, and of course on the challenges of curtailing financing of terror using these websites. The next panelist will be the expert from the Al-Qaeda Sanctions Monitoring Team, Ms. Frédérick Gauthier. Over to you, ma'am, for 8 minutes.
Je vais m'exprimer en français.
I'll speak in French. Now, under the monitoring team's mandate and introducing our assessment of the threat, the monitoring team for a number of years has been dealing with a broad scope of the use of Internet by individuals and entities related to Al-Qaeda and more than 75 terrorist groups who are now on the list, the sanctions list of the Security Council Committee. If the use of Internet by Islamic State in Iraq and Syria area has been the subject of considerable attention recently because of the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters. We must point out the number of other entities like Al-Qaeda have always used Internet and continue to do so. Now, why has that been so successful? Because Internet is multifunctional for terrorists. It's sort of a Swiss knife. It allows them to cross borders, and it's very fast, it's instantaneous, it offers anonymity, and it's a perfect part of this generational experience. Now, and also it has a cost-benefit, considerable cost benefits. It also allows them to spread their ideology of the most violent nature. What we saw recently has highlighted the multiple functional nature of these technologies and their use by terrorist groups for strategic purposes and for propaganda. This is based on a tactical and ongoing use of this, which targets particular population groups that are particularly vulnerable, such as young people. ISIL and other groups are now using Internet and social media as a media space to put forward their allegiances and their attacks. Now, in the past, terrorist groups used press agencies, but they also act like specialized agencies now. They launch disinformation campaigns and even counter-offensive against the counter message that is being sent out. Now, they also provide advice in many different languages to attract a broader audience, and they target those people who are sensitive to this ideology in order to recruit them. Even if we do know that Internet is now a fundamental tool for the process of radicalization and recruiting of foreign terrorist fighters, the personal contact with individuals or cells is also seen at one stage or other in the radicalization and recruitment process. Now, these two uses of Internet have already been referred to. Now, our concern as a monitoring team also deals with other bad uses of the Internet, talking about encrypted information using protected systems. This allows them to organize and plan their attacks and operations. This is of great concern with regard to the use of Internet and apps. In this respect, ISIL are operating in a very specific way. They use Internet openly for their propaganda, but it's also interesting to note how these groups are very concerned by ensuring the security of their operational information. Once within the organization, the members obtain information and very clear guidelines as to the operational measures, clandestine measures, in order to ensure total confidentiality. And terrorists are very qualified in new technologies. They use them for operational purposes, and particularly they are very skilled in coding, because they use Internet as a platform for sharing their information, for example, to provide information on how to build improvised explosive devices. They also have the capacity to train the followers, to provide logistical support to them. They use the dark webs as virtual deposits, which are decentralized in order to obtain sensitive materials such as weapons and passports, like other groups do, like mafia groups do, and they use these platforms also as a funding mechanism. The recent report of Dr. Broder Gaddafi, in which the monitoring group participated, examined the use of the growing use of the Internet for financing terrorism. This is a great platform for transferring funds across borders, but also to get funds through participative funding programs. So this goes beyond propaganda and recruitment, and it's through this threat that the Security Council is particularly involved in dealing with this. A number of resolutions provide a framework for reflection. 2161 expresses the Security Council's concern at the various uses of Internet. And through this resolution, it has also mandated the monitoring team to bring together and follow information with regard to the implementation of measures with regard to preventing the misuse of Internet for criminal purposes. And 2170 also highlights this. And then 2178, dealing with foreign terrorist fighters, the Security Council has urged member states to act in cooperation in order to establish measures of a significant nature dealing with the abuse of internet by terrorist groups. Now, in this framework, 1267 committee and the sanctions committees have provide a preventive tool, and this is available to member states. And 2161 and 2196 say that the use of internet services for terrorists is considered as providing support to terrorist groups and can represent a violation of the assets ban. Now, the weapons embargo under the sanctions regime is also a very important sanction because it also provides for an embargo on the provision of technical advice, assistance, or military training. Thus, this means that the use of social media and the internet and other technologies for terrorist ends can represent a basis for putting an individual or an entity on the sanctions list. The committee has already put on the list the internet activities of 3 entities so far. The 1267 committee has supported the monitoring team's recommendation, which calls upon inviting private sector companies to inform us of their activities. So today and tomorrow will be the first stage to allow the implementation of all these resolutions I've just referred to can be implemented in an effective way. Now, today, the challenge that we share with the providers of access to internet and social media is to prevent their services continue to be used for criminal purposes by international terrorist organizations. For example, we've noted the substantial efforts being deployed under the terms and conditions of some websites and platforms to combat racism, anti-Semitism, child pornography, and to protect the reputation of individuals, and particularly vulnerable groups such as young people. Now, this potentially provides constructive bases which could be used in terms of partnership with these private sector companies to support their efforts, to ensure that they do conform to the spirit behind the sanctions regime, and also to provide targeted tools to deal with this threat. Because we're talking here today about combating terrorism and international security. Now, behind all this, there are victims. There are people who die. So we need to discuss this responsibility between the United Nations, member states, and private sector companies, with the goal of ensuring solid cooperation which is responsible and lasting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think you emphasized on 2 aspects. One was the generational appeal and the sophistication of the terrorist networks to use technology to reach the youth and a cross-section of demography around the world. And the second, of course, was the means available with member countries to sanction individuals and entities who use this medium to incite and advise on activities such as use of force and violence. The final presentation is by Frédérick Douzet, and you have 8 minutes, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your invitation. So the terrorist attacks in France were a huge shock because many people died, but also because they were perpetrated by young people who were born and raised in France and turned against their nation. And they were only the tip of the iceberg of a much larger phenomenon. We have about 1,500 kids who have left for Syria and have started coming back, and that represents a major security threat. And we have about 7,000 young people who are suspected of being in the process of violent radicalization. Why do these kids radicalize, and how do they come to take action? There are many theories, and probably each of them contains only part of the answer, considering how complex and how multi-dimensional the phenomenon is, and more research is clearly needed. But they have one clear criteria in common, is that internet and the social media have played a major role in the process of their radicalization and recruitment. Many of them radicalize quietly in their rooms, and it can take only weeks or several months before they can fall into violent extremism. How do they do that? They start accessing content online. Many of them have never been to a mosque. They start watching YouTube videos. They get offered more YouTube videos to watch with the algorithms. And then at some point they get detected by ISIS and they get contacted through Facebook. They tend to be isolated from their friends and families, and eventually the organization plans a trip for them to Syria or some type of action. So that creates a situation that is very hard to predict and very hard to detect. As a result, fighting online propaganda and online recruitment has become a major priority for the French government and for many other governments as well. And there's been a lot of tough talk, but I have the feeling that we're still very much reacting to a situation that we don't fully understand, and we're still searching for our strategic goals. And I'm not government, I'm seeing this from an academic perspective, so maybe I don't have all the information. But clearly, ISIS has a brilliant communication strategy, a strategy that's very comprehensive. So the question I tend to ask is, what is our strategic approach? And do we have one that is consistent across government agencies within the government, but also across countries? I will take only one example, which is blocking propaganda. If you take the first, there is a huge concern about the role and eventually the responsibility of social media platforms. Because if you take the example of France, propaganda happens mostly through American platforms on which France has no authority. The access to information is very limited. The access to evidence to prosecute suspects is very limited. And we've noticed that jihadists are very good at taking advantage of legal loopholes. So we do have international cooperation, and it works very well with the FBI when we're in a life-threatening emergency. But when we're just trying to collect information and evidence, then we have to go through the MLAT process, and I think it takes about 12 months before we can get requests for evidence. So there's definitely room for progress, but the result of that is that the platforms themselves are left with the decision of whether they let access to the information, whether they take down the websites or not, because the international cooperation in justice is way too long. So it gives them a lot of power, and I believe power comes with responsibility, and we clearly need to cooperate in that area. In France, there's been a lot of effort at trying to block websites, take down jihadist content, and suppress, get Twitter or Facebook accounts suppressed. We've blocked about 89 websites. No need to say it's a drop in the ocean, and that is despite increased cooperation with the platforms. So it has had limited results, first in the scope of what we've been able to do, but also considering the agility of ISIS and its capacity to adapt. And it has also other side effects, like reinforcing the status of martyr or conspiracy theories that we've seen. It's been criticized also because it has limited the ability to conduct surveillance, and it has been criticized also because of free speech and civil liberties issues, because a lot of these decisions have been taken out of the decision of a judge. So that's one aspect. We're trying as much as we can to limit jihadist content online. But then there is the other end of the story, which is the source of the propaganda. And there's been revelations in Der Spiegel that have shown that there was a great dependency of ISIS on the satellites for internet connection. And it works a bit like in a bubble with 3 major European satellite operators that are the gateway to the internet for the organization. So this is a question that maybe we can discuss, but how much cooperation can we get from them as well? Could they possibly monitor suspect traffic and track down the origins of propaganda? And maybe they do, I don't know. But there is an analogy maybe with what the banks are doing with TrackFin in order to detect some of suspect activity and share information with authorities. And we've seen through interviews with prisoners that there is a strong hierarchy and centralization of decision in Raqqa media headquarters with nodes and links to other countries that also need to be addressed. So the question is, could there be some action taken in cooperation to take down, to incapacitate their servers, to blacklist some of internet providers from access to satellite connectivity, to target the propaganda at its source and block its propagation, if that's what we want to do. But of course, the argument is also that if we do that, we would potentially kill the ability to monitor content and go blind. So I think we need to understand very well what our strategic goals are, and we need to do that at the international level, not just at the national level, because we really need consistency from one end to the other propaganda chain, because otherwise all the efforts that are being led at the level of national governments to and at the level of platforms to block content and to block accounts would be useless as long as the propaganda is not also blocked at its source, because there's going to be too much content out there and too many ways around the blockage. So I think it's important to address this question of strategic goals. How do we better balance the need for intelligence and knowing what's going on for the long term with the need of action like blocking propaganda? And I think we need to articulate a strategic vision that takes into account the ability to use the information collected by intelligence services for defense in order to disorganize and disrupt the capabilities of the enemy, or to use it for the judiciary in order to collect evidence and prosecute suspects, because most of the perpetrators of the attacks were very well known to our intelligence services. How do we collaborate with social media platforms? And also, and that's something I might address tomorrow, how do we use the new tools and metrics that have been developed by technology companies to measure the effects of the actions we're taking in order to stop the propaganda or to counter the message? Because we do a lot of things, but it's very hard to evaluate whether any of what we do is actually changing something and having any kind of effect. So to finish, I strongly believe that we need to think very strategically about this and agree on a strategy at the international level. And I think we need a comprehensive approach. I took just one example, but we need to fight both the organization and its ability to deliver sophisticated propaganda. We need to fight the propaganda itself. And we need not to forget, because that's very important, to act on the reasons why the kids in our neighborhoods are so receptive to this propaganda. And that's probably the hardest part, and that's the most long-term goal. But I strongly believe that this can't be done without the help of the platforms and the operators who have access to the data, who have access to the resources and the skills that our governments often lack in the face of such a huge challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Frédérick. I was particularly struck by your phrase, radicalization in their rooms. And I think that's certainly the biggest challenge. You obviously raised the issue of MLAT process and whether it's fast enough to keep up with the speed of the internet itself and the way it's being deployed. And certainly a very important issue of acting against the source itself. And can we track down the source? And can we use technology to negate that as well? We will now open it up to the floor. Since we are running behind the clock, we will have 10 minutes for discussions. I have a request by the Chinese delegate already, so I will request him to present his thoughts in 2 minutes.
Microphone, please. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I wish to thank CTC for convening this meeting. I wish to welcome the presence of the experts and thank them for their interventions. Having heard some interventions, I think I benefited greatly. I would like to ask the panelists, just as the director of CTED and the panelists mentioned, right now there's tens of millions of audio and video materials on internet. for inciting terrorist acts. Some are concentrated on certain countries, and some even make use of their own country's server to launch terrorist threats against other countries. As members of the Security Council and also members of the United Nations, what should we do to urge our social media companies to do something to put a stop to or manage a terrorist threat against other countries via audio and video? Thank you.
Any other comments from the floor? Yes, ma'am. Can you identify yourself?
Valerie Schilling with the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. It's been a very interesting discussion, and one element that I'd like to add into it is the potential for the social networking sites to be used to raise funds for the purposes of terrorism. This is something that the FATF has done some research on in the past year. We published a typologies report on ISIL in February of this year, and in October we published a follow-up report on emerging terrorist financing trends and methods. Certainly some of the challenges for financing through social media is that a common typology in this area is that a website will be set up purporting to be collecting money for charity. People then donate to that site, and it makes it very challenging for law enforcement to then distinguish between who is actually supporting the terrorist cause and who is unwittingly donating to it. Certainly the challenges of evidence gathering are very prominent in the terrorist financing area as well when it's being done through social media, and the cross-border element makes it particularly challenging. One of the things that our typologies work has highlighted is that a public-private partnership is often a very good mechanism for adding value in this area. So working with the platforms, they have a lot of information that they are often very willing to share with the authorities and to work with the authorities. And so collaboration in that area is certainly a very important aspect. Other things that have been brainstormed certainly at the FATF level is some of the challenges when you start monitoring or trying to block some of these sites, and certainly the balance that needs to be struck on the human rights and privacy side, which is also very important. The possibility of potentially making some of these crowdfunding platforms and other companies potentially reporting entities is another thing that some countries and jurisdictions are considering. It's certainly something that the FATF is continuing to look at, and thank you for the opportunity to intervene.
Thank you, ma'am. The lady at the back, please.
Good morning. I am Anusha Rahman Khan, the Minister for State for IT from Pakistan. And I would like to ask this question, and I would like to also put this proposition to the panel, that how do you handle the fine line between freedom of speech and the hate speech material on web? How do we criminalize in the international context? How do we handle the freedom of expression proponents and at the same time penalize what we consider as terrorism or hate speech? And then, are we going to talk about rewriting the freedom of expression that was probably conceived in the last century and the challenges that we face?
We have a whole panel on that,
21st.
We have a whole panel on that, but I will let them respond to you.
Thank you.
Any other comments? The last final comment from someone on the floor? Sir, please. Oh, we'll take both.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the panelists. It's been really fruitful for me also. I would like to state that terrorism doesn't have any religion, language, or borders. we are concentrated today in ISIL, but it's not the only terrorist organization. It's been using really social media and internet tools very much, but there are also other terrorist organizations. And for example, the colleague from Pakistan has given the hate speech example, and we will be discussing in another panel, but that is also an important issue. And I would like to restate that no country is immune to terrorism, and when there is, everyone has agreed that cooperation should be made, but timing in that cooperation is really important. I mean, if minutes are sometimes important, and we have seen that these platforms, some countries can maybe have the opportunity to monitor more than the other countries, but if you have that power, then you should also have the responsibility to cooperate and give that information to the other countries, because you monitor in one side and the action is taken in another side, and as my country Turkey, we are facing to this problem very much, and we would be pleased to have more cooperation on that. Thank you
very much. And the final comment from the gentleman at the back.
My name is Shadrach Harun. I come from the Commonwealth. I want to take the issue of international cooperation, which was mentioned by the last speaker. I think we're going to have a whole panel on that particular aspect. But I think for now, it is so clear that issues should be taken by the UN at the UN level to discuss what type of cooperation, what type of MLAT model should be drawn for member states to subscribe to, because we know the evidence involved in this case when it comes to cyber or electronic evidence is volatile, and we need real-time cooperation. And I don't know what the UN is doing currently, because it has to be done at such a level. I know some regions like the EU have 247 network, which can easily cooperate on these issues. But where it comes to outside EU, or where there's no such platform, how do you handle this type of evidence? Thank you very much.
Thank you. 30-second intervention, please.
Good morning. Thank you. Najmuddin Lakal, I'm director at the Foreign Ministry in Tunisia. Can you hear? Okay, good. I think there was a key question that Professor Douzet asked, why the kids are attracted to propaganda. And I think the key words now, I heard a lot of things about technology tools, how we use to counter those, the propaganda, but there was no word about education. Because when you have a kid who has a degree, a master's degree, and then he became a terrorist, there is a question, how he is attracted. Education is a key. Family education. We talk about private sector, government, we talk about civil society, but we don't talk about the family. How we educate family, how we educate them to help their kids and to prevent them from being targeted by propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go back to the panelists now, and we'll go in the reverse order. Let me start with Ms. Douzet. And you'll have a minute and a half to try and pick and choose the answers you want to give.
Okay, so it's going to be very short, maybe reflecting on how to collaborate with the platforms. I think I can contribute France's experience, where they have created a platform where there are forms that government people can fill in order to let the platforms know which content to take down. And it used to take a week. Now it's down. Treating these requests is down to 90 minutes, and I think we can do much better. It all rests onto setting criteria that both governments and the platform could agree on, so that at least the majority of these requests can be treated very quickly. And on the last point, which I care very much about, I do believe that education is absolutely key. Yes, education from the families, but a lot of these kids come from pretty disrupted families, so I think we have to work more globally on educating them to critical thinking, educating them to the new media and to images, and learn how to understand these images and deconstruct perception, so that whenever they have conspiracy theories, or whenever they're confronted to sophisticated videos, they have enough judgment to not buy it.
Thank you. Madam Gauthier, and I would especially be interested in hearing your views on what the lady raised about diversion of funds, or the duplicitous use of charity for funding terror.
Thank you. I quoted in my presentation the report from October of the GAFI, which offers, and I invite people to read it because it gives us a very broad perspective of the use of social media and new technologies when it comes to financing terrorism. Just a few words to say that the monitoring team in its last mandate now has the authority to discuss with private companies. We've already done so with the financial institutions and banks, and the objective that we set for ourselves is to be able to have robust cooperation, because as the speaker said earlier, we're always unfortunately reacting to things and we're not proactive enough. It's true that a characteristic of new technology is that it evolves very quickly, and so the goal is to have an open and frank debate with new technology companies to make the sanctions regimes more effective. As I said, there are tools that exist that are available to member states, and the responsibility for their effectiveness has to be shared as well by member states, but also private companies from now on. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I come to you, Mr. Abregov?
Thank you. I've been able to note a couple of questions. They were related to the need to enhance the speed with which we take decisions with regard to the use of the internet, and particularly in the Russian Federation our legislation has been modified with this idea in mind, and that is we block information without a decision from a judge, from a court. This allows us to combat in this way in an effective way. Now, if we are taken to court for this, then we will challenge this. And once again, as has been rightly pointed out, what we need is to take the proper steps in an effective and quick way. And this is how we see it. Thank you.
And finally, to our friend from the FBI.
I think I'm on now. I will just say that a lot of we've spoken about the speed of response, about getting information out, especially to the MLAT requests. And I will speak, admittedly, from a somewhat smaller law enforcement perspective. Our view is and always will be that the protection of life is always going to come first and foremost. So when we have information, no matter where it is, about a life-threatening event, that information will get passed immediately. Attacks, no matter where they happen, if they happen in Bamako or if they happen in Paris, affect us just as much as they affect everyone else. So we will never sit on information that will affect people's lives. The MLAT process is slow. It does involve various legal assistance treaties, as it's in the name, various legal organizations, so that's what happens. But we do need to remember that what we're all fighting against here is making sure that everyone comes home alive at the end of the day. And that's kind of where our focus is and will remain, that we are here to make sure, and everyone is here, to make sure that people's lives are first and foremost. So that information will always go out as quickly as we get it, and then we will deal with the legal ramifications of that afterwards. So.
Thank you very much. With this, we bring this session to a close. I think all of them stressed on cooperation, on speed, on keeping up with technology, but certainly on strengthening some of the traditional areas of intervention, including families, education, law enforcement, and cooperation between countries and within countries with the private sector. So let me quickly ask you to join me in thanking this panel for their interventions, and to request the next panelist to join me, because we have to make up for the time we lost this morning. So thank you very much. We saved 10 minutes. We made up 10 minutes. We started at 10:35.
Yeah.
I'll make up 5 minutes.
Okay.
Just grab my notes.
All right. I guess we still have 8 minutes even if we are behind the schedule.
Yeah.
8 minutes each.
Yeah, you'll have 8 minutes each. I'll make up. We will extend the time by a little bit.
All right.
8 minutes each.
All right.
I think it was good, right?
Oh, okay, that's good. And changing. Okay, but I'm the first. Am I the first one to use? Yes, you're the first one. But the first one. So I'm the first one using PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see. All right. Are you with the observatory?
Excellencies, welcome back for the session on current threats posed by the use of internet and social media for terrorist purposes. As a continuation of the previous session, we will now touch on current threats and challenges with a focus on emerging technologies that could be abused by terrorists for the purpose that we have already discussed in the previous session, which is radicalization, incitement, recruitment, travel and financial assistance, and coordinating planning of terrorist activities. We will also stress on the importance of preparedness, planning and coordination to respond to this challenge. We have with us again a very eminent panel who will touch on these issues. I will again request and remind each of our panelists to limit their presentations to 8 minutes. It will be followed by an open discussion again. Interventions from the floor should be limited to 2 minutes. And those of you who do not get a chance to intervene today can load their comments on the CTED's website. Our first panelist will be Ms. Riazi, Chief Information Technology Officer, UN Office of Information Communication Technologies. Ms. Riazi, you have the floor for 8 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning to all my colleagues here on the panel, my panelists, and of course all of you. It's a privilege to be here participating and sharing this panel with so many people who know a lot more about these topics than I do. But I do like to talk about technology. We look every day at the advancements of technology and the power of technology, and with the Sustainable Development Goals, we look at technology and how it could positively impact a lot of those goals, and it certainly can. Because looking at how technology has transformed us the last 50 years, it's been an incredible transformation. We've gone from the Industrial Revolution to Computer Revolution. We've gone from being Homo sapiens to Homo mobilis to connected sapiens. And a lot changes when we move to a connected space. We've seen a positive impact when you look at the advancements technology and healthcare, technology and education, technology and commerce, tremendous impact in so many industries, positive impacts where we can bring in remote doctors and remote education to so many parts of this world. And if you look at the 20th century, this was an incredible century with 2 world wars and a Cold War and sending a man to the moon, but the most critical part, innovation part of that century was the internet. We created the internet and we connected. We connected ourselves and we connected us to everything else within our world. So huge progress, huge innovation, but there are ironic and unintended consequences to innovation. And sometimes we can determine what they are, and sometimes we can't. And when we look at cyber terrorism or cyber wars of the future or cyber attacks or cyber crime, these are the unintended and the ironic consequences. And the question for us as governments and the private sector and civil society is how are we going to deal with that? Because this problem is not small. This problem is huge. And it requires a different type of thinking, because a lot of time we try to resolve issues in the cyberspace with the same thinking as we try to resolve issues in the physical world. And a lot of times they don't work, because what the cyber world has basically done is our whole notion of identity and privacy, intellectual property, issues of trust. These are the issues that it has questioned. And if you look at the dark web or the deep web and the crime that has moved to that space, those people don't really care what kind of policies we have in place. For over $450 billion is lost because of the cybercrime every year, and a very small percentage of the criminals are caught, because the mechanism to fight the crime or fight the terrorism is not there. And if we are to do it globally, it requires that $400 billion investment. And I'm not sure if we are there. So as we go forward, we look at the UN, we look at what our mission is and how do we deliver our mission on the substantive side of our business, and we say, how will that change in 5 to 10 years, and how is it changing today? If you look at the dark web, over 80% of human trafficking is done on the dark web. Meanwhile, when we look at governments and the UN and other entities, most of our time is spent in the physical world. If we look at the crime, the biggest area of terrorism is the impact and the attacks of the industrial systems of the countries. A lot of the industrial systems, from your electric grid to transportation, to water, to waste, military, financials, they've all been connected to the internet. They all have old technology, and it's very easy to bring the electric grid down in a country, and the impact of that is huge. So when we talk about social media and terrorism online and negative and calls for terrorists or negative language or negative space, we have a much bigger issue. This is just scratching the surface of what terrorism can be. And when it comes to the terrorism of the future and the cyber wars of the future, we can't really determine where it comes from, who is it, and how do we stop it. So I do think we have to come up with a proposal, a plan, an action, which involves every country. It involves the civil society. It involves the governments and the private sector to determine what we can do. And we include the civil society. We cannot address the big issue of cybersecurity, cyber terrorism, cyber crime as governments alone. Because this is, the governments don't have enough resources or funding to handle this. As the dark web has been created, as a negative space has been created, we have to create the light web and the positive message. And that's on all of us. As the terrorists are, and terrorists are recruiting IT people, as the criminals are recruiting programmers to do what is destructive, we have to recruit IT people and programmers globally to do what's good. And that requires a global action and a different perspective in addressing this. So we are creating a group we call Digital Blue Helmet. This is the beginning of the cyber czars, where we call them the good guys. And we hope through partnership we can grow this group, grow this team that would begin to provide that cyber expertise and try to do a call to action to everyone to get involved and get engaged, to create the light space that counteracts the dark space that is right now responsible for $450 billion financial loss and much of the crime that's taking place globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Riazi. Digital blue helmets, a great idea. Look forward to that panning out. The next speaker is Mr. Jokinen, Advisor Action Against Terrorism Unit of the OSCE. Mr. Jokinen, you have the floor for 8 minutes. Sorry. You have the floor for 8 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. In my presentation, I'm going to tell you shortly about some recent OSCE activities on countering the use of Internet for terrorist purposes. And I will then summarize some key findings and recommendations from these activities. Oh, sorry, I need to, I have the, oh yeah. Okay. All right, we continue. So, within our mandate, we support our participating states and partners for cooperation to build capacities and strengthen responses to counter the use of Internet for terrorist purposes. In this field, we have recently organized, among others, national and regional expert workshops. In our activities, we promote human rights and fundamental freedoms. We focus on vulnerable groups like women and youth, and we promote also public-private partnerships. I would like to also highlight here our repository program on countering the use of Internet for terrorist purposes, which outlines our activities this year, next year, and in 2017. The first event in October, we organized a 2-day expert workshop on media freedom and responsibilities in the context of counterterrorism policies. It was organized jointly with the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, and this event brought together around 100 experts from 22 participating states and partners for cooperation, international organizations, NGOs, academia, and business circles, dealing with the traditional and social media to look at ways to improve the shared responsibility to protect media freedom while developing effective policies to counter the use of Internet for terrorist purposes. And just to mention that we are planning to organize a follow-up event on high level related to this topic in 2016. Another event or events, we organized 2 national expert workshops in Uzbekistan in May and in Turkmenistan in November on the request of these countries with a little bit broader scope, addressing terrorist use of Internet, cybercrime, and other cyber threats. And we are planning to organize similar events, national, regional workshops also in 2016. Next one, let's say, as we have heard today, terrorists use the Internet for the incitement, recruitment, and training, as well as for planning, communication, and execution of acts of terrorism. OSCE participating states and partners for cooperation face significant challenges in criminalizing and prosecuting such acts, since the investigation and prosecution of such cases require inter alia special investigative skills in computer forensics, as critical digital evidence is typically located on the computers or mobile devices utilized. So, in response to this challenge, we organized, together with the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law, IIJ, a regional training workshop on countering the use of Internet for terrorist purposes for judges, prosecutors, and investigators from the OSCE Mediterranean Partners for Cooperation, And we are planning, again, to continue this type of activities in 2016. And now some key findings from these activities. So, I would like to, let's say, the first key finding is that the world offline does matter. We have spoken a lot about the importance of the context. Whatever happens on the internet and social media has an origin and impact in real life. We cannot deal with the social media space and internet in isolation. We may need to do something offline to have an effective impact online. Conversely, whatever we do or say online will be also perceived and judged in light of what we do or what is happening offline. This is particularly important if you consider terrorism as a symptom of deeper ills in society, the result of different political, socio-economic factors interplaying, and that is imperative to address the conditions conducive to terrorism. The second key finding is that I would like to highlight a question that should be central to countering violent extremism. What do we have on offer? As we know, extremists and terrorists compete for followers, sympathizers. They compete with us on the ideological level, on the emotional level, on the social level, both offline and online. We need to reclaim the space, both online and offline, that we have left extremists free to occupy. So we need something compelling to offer. Saying that Islamic State or Daesh is bad is not good enough. Saying people should not travel to Syria is not good enough. We have to offer more than don'ts. As the third key finding, do we know who exactly we are trying to reach online? The general public, broad segments of society, specific individuals. Perhaps we should do all of that, a mixture of broad and narrow casting. Our approaches will need to be necessarily different, tailored, targeted to be effective. This brings me to the fourth key finding, the issue of credibility and who should do what online. We all recognize the limitations to government direct engagement in strategic communications. So governments hope that civil society activists, formers, community leaders will rise to the challenge both offline and online. However, when there are some committed civil society advocates, some brilliant ideas and projects, there is no funding. So the funding and resources is a problem. My last two key findings are very dear to OSCE as an organization committed to promoting security through human rights and the rule of law. I have emphasized so far non-punitive punitive and positive approaches to countering extremism and terrorism online, rather than the repressive one. Because we know that the risk of violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, especially freedom of expression and privacy, are very high. It is a fact that a number of governments have adopted vague laws to criminalize extremism, laws that are inimical to freedom of expression and open to abuse to stifle political decent silence opposition. There needs to be clear lines drawn to justify either a lawful criminal justice response or another form of response. Inciting to violence or inciting to hatred are clearly red lines. But if speech and expression fall short of that, repression is not the solution. There should be a response, but it should be different, and the security sector should not be leading this response. So, quickly, some recommendations. I know I'm over the time. So what we need to do is define precisely and narrowly the scope for repressive action in accordance with human rights and the rule of law. We need to promote positive use of online media, positive messages. We need to focus on end-user empowerment and resilience. And we need to combine online and offline initiatives. And last but not least, develop genuine public-private partnerships with civil society and with businesses. And just to finalize my presentation, I would like to share with you that we are planning to develop an e-learning module on countering the use of internet for terrorist purposes in 2016. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir. Impossible to capture the width of your presentation, but certainly one of the emphasis is the role of regions and regional groupings to take the lead in responding to some of the challenges. The third panelist is Mr. Daniel Cohen, Coordinator Cybersecurity Program at the INSS. Mr. Cohen, you have the floor for 8 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about the use of the internet and the social media by the Islamic State, but take under consideration that we see a lesson learned by other terror organizations like Al-Qaeda, and they are like starting to catch the gap. First of all, the Islamic State, I see it as operating in 3 circles. One of them is geographical, in the territories that they hold. The second one is cybernetic. But there is a third one, and it's a key ingredient, and it's consciousness. Now, consciousness, I mean the use of extreme brutality, the destroying of historic symbols of other ethnical population in the areas that they rule. And we see it, all of them like combined between them, the cyber and the geographical in the consciousness, and I will show you a few examples later on. First of all, the modus of operandi of the Islamic State. We're talking about psychological warfare, about propaganda, about recruitment, terror attacks. I mean terror attacks that are organized, and also terror attacks that are not organized, but by incitement online, what we call the AKA lone wolf attacks or spontaneous attacks. Also communication between organization members. We see it also deep web, but we also see communication in chats, in private rooms, that we can find them also in the regular web. And cyber terrorism is the last one. Now we see in our research in the Institute, we saw like a combination between all of these parts together. You can see a cyber terrorism attack, like a simple DDoS attack against a government site of some country. But the day before it, you will see a beheading video that is published in social media, or psychological warfare by some kind of a banner and a message. And we see a lot of time all the things like go together, and the reason is to get maximum exposure in traditional media, but also in the social media, and in the end of the day to get more recruitments, and also to fight for the narrative of the Islamic State. Now, if we look at the organizational chart of the media of the Islamic State, the credit here is for Quirlam Foundation from UK. We're talking about more than 6 or 7, depends on which day you count, of media centers. And they also have more than 35 regional centers that are divided by the region that took alliance to the Islamic State. Now, all of this is like, it works together. It does also, after they produce materials in the regional or the general media centers, we see them pass it on to more than thousands of fighters that like spread it viral in a coordinated way. It also is backed up by cyber units. We know about a few of them, people that have the technology to do attacks like injection in global jihadic movement sites or in other places, and again to get the maximum exposure. And behind all of this, we have the campaigners, the strategic mind that set up the narrative to do so. Now, if we try to look on the aims of this chart, first of all, it's up bottom, to influence decision makers around the world, especially ones that take part in the coalition against the Islamic State. We see it bottom up to create fear to civilians like other terror organizations do, but also to create fear in the territories domestically of the Islamic State. Now, if we look on the target audience, this is an example that I brought from June 2014, when the Islamic State started to create all kinds of archives in different platforms. We will see later on, I think, one of the videos from this archive. This archive, you see tweets, also journals like the Dabik, but also videos. Now, the magnified shows us one of the videos. It's a recruitment video, and it was translated to 13 different languages. Now, in these countries that it was targeted by the language, we saw also optimization of how to get in and get, again, the maximum exposure and to recruit more people. And we see it again and again and again. There are 6 languages that they use the most, but there are other languages that we see them use, and it can depend geopolitical or geostrategically. If one of the borders is closed somewhere, you will see them then create more videos to other places. So this is an example for that. Now, the platforms started in the big social media companies that I think everyone in this room used at least one of them. It was started by diaries, by blogs of people that immigrated to the Islamic State. But the Islamic State, let's say, network or system, all of these central media centers, it's like a parasite. It started in the big social media companies, but once it got blocked, once they used all the resources over there, they moved to another platform. And we see it again and again and again. The whole system moves. Of course, you can still find materials or web pages or blogs of the Islamic State in the traditional media, traditional social media, like the big companies, but we see them move on, and it doesn't mean that they will go again. For example, we see Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, and Tumblr. They can go again back then, but for now, they moved on. And one of the, I think, the main reasons that we fail again and again to block them completely and block their accounts, because by the time we started to get that they are in one of these platforms, they already moved on to another one, because they are dynamic and flexible, and they use technology in a very fast time and know how to do this transition. Now, there was a question before about why it so appeals to the youngsters. So if we go into the eyes of young people, maybe this is one of the things that they will see. Now, it depends, because there are some ingredients that every one of them uses, but if we look at, let's say, from the same level of eyes, you will see people that are looking for, first of all, the utopia of the Islamic State. These pictures are from Raqqa and Mosul mostly, and it seems like they're having fun over there. This is, of course, not the real reality. This is a twisted reality that they are showing us. It's also a brotherhood, it's a community, and they also have pizza nights. So for young people that see that, maybe it's easier to say, okay, this is maybe a good place that I want to find my identity back, or be part of something big, some part of a brotherhood, also a womanhood. And if you wrap it up with a simple and very effective message, it's either you go and immigrate to the Islamic State, pack up your bags, take your passport and go there in Syria or in Iraq. The other option is to go and to do jihad. So it's to commit terror attacks. These are the 2 options that they give, and it's very simple but very, very effective. And if I go back to what we talk about in the same level of eyes, I think the first solution needs to be, we need to change this, let's say, positive way of thinking of they are the cool kids in the block. And if we go back to education, first of all, we need to give alternatives and in a positive way, but also negative to shame these symbols. All of this is from Tumblr, from accounts of Islamic State supporters. And last thing, we need to find ways to take back space and time, try to compress it, and don't leave them the borders that they can act, because for now it seems that they are everywhere, even if they're not anywhere, even if they are only in Syria and Iraq. So we need to find ways to compress it, and I have a few solutions. I will maybe say them later on in the panel. So thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that was a very detailed presentation on the intricate, effective, and clearly an attractive message to some on recruitment and on getting some of them to change the way they have till now been approaching their daily lives. But it has, what clearly for me, what you showed was that it has features of the dispersed and nimble organization, and yet it has form, purpose, objectives that are normally used by more formal communication machineries of states and even large corporations. So I think they have been able to use both of those features quite well. The final presentation for this particular session is going to be by Mr. Xavier Lesaca, who is with the International Observatory on the Study of Terrorism in Spain. You have the floor, 8 minutes.
Thank you very much to CTED and CTC for organizing this special event. There we go. Thank you very much to CTED and CTC for organizing this special event. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The data and the research I'm going to present today is part of a research project that I am developing at the School of Public Communication at the University of Navarra in Spain and the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University in DC. The so-called Islamic State has emerged in less than 2 years as one of the major security challenges for the global community. According to United Nations, nearly 30,000 foreign citizens from more than 100 countries have joined ISIS and other terrorist branches during the last year. There is no single simple answer to explain the growth of admiration and attraction that young citizens all around the world feel about joining international terrorism. However, trying to understand this phenomenon from the perspective of public communication and specifically from the perspective of digital communication may provide some clues. How does ISIS digital communication strategy work? How much is this terrorist group communicating? What is ISIS saying in social media? How are they framing their messages? How do they connect with their potential audiences? Answering those questions is vital to understand the current threats and challenges posed by terrorist use of the internet and social media. Thus, it is also of great importance to build an effective communication strategy devoted to counter ISIS plans. So, how does ISIS digital communication strategy work? The communication strategy of ISIS relies on the following elements. First of all, as you can see in this picture, daily press releases edited in fancy display and in different languages, modern and well-designed infographics as the most relevant institutions in the world, newsletters with pictures every day, 3-4 newsletters with pictures, magazines in English, French, Russian and Turkish, an official news and broadcast agency with its own application for smartphones, 3 global audiovisual producers, Al-Hayat, Al-Furqan, Al-Iktisam, and then a branch of 34 regional audiovisual producers established in 10 different countries, all of them, as other panelists mentioned, perfectly coordinated into the same strategy. So how much is this terrorist group communicating? I'm going to focus specifically on all the audiovisual productions done by the 3 audiovisual producers and the 34 regional audiovisual producers. Since January 2014 until the end of November 2015, the net of 37 audiovisual producers of ISIS has released 1,005 videos. In fact, 1,026 today, in less than 2 years. As you can see in this graphic, the number of campaigns rises at summer 2014, when ISIS took control over large areas of Iraq and Syria. Since January 2014, the number of ISIS campaigns remains very similar. I'm talking about videos, with an average of 2-3 videos released per day. In the next graphic, you can see how also, since summer 2014, ISIS released most of their campaigns using the regional producers in the blue line. The number of campaigns released by the global producers, Al-Hayat, Al-Furqan, Al-Iktisam, the red line, remains very low. This fact shows how ISIS is segmenting their messages in order to engage better with their potential audiences, sending tailored and different messages for different audiences, which shows how complex and sophisticated this strategy is. What is ISIS saying in social media? The videos of ISIS are divided in 4 main thematics. Acts of war, 30% of the thematics in blue, is the blue in the graphic, is the most repeated thematic of ISIS videos. They want to show to their audiences that they are a victorious movement ready to defeat any army and any nation in the world. Interviews with Mujahideens, 25%, in red, is the second largest thematic. Videos showing different terrorists from all over the world explaining why they have joined ISIS. I want to show you this example.
My name is Abu Muslim. I'm your brother in Islam here in Syria. I originally come from Canada.
يا فوز من نال الشهادة صادقا تمحى الذنوب إذا الدماء تقطروا وإذا الزهور تعطرت.
Before Islam, I was like any other regular Canadian. I watched hockey. I went to the cottage in the summertime. I loved to fish. I wanted to go hunting.
So you see, this is an example of a Canadian. Of a Canadian foreign fighter saying that he's not an strange. In fact, he's a normal Canadian and appealing to Canadians I mean, in the same language, in the same cultural language, talking directly and specifically to their audiences. The third large thematic is governmental and institutional videos, 18% in green. Those videos present ISIS as any other government and official institution of the world. How they maintain the health system, the justice, the reparation of roads, the commerce, and also videos showing how happy are those citizens living under ISIS control areas. Let's go to see another example.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Abu Yusuf. I'm one of the medical team here in Raqqa. I, alhamdulillah, made hijrah from Australia to the Islamic State to come and live.
Again, it's a positive message showing that they are a state and everything works. And I mean, if you want to attract people from Australia, you have to present themselves as this way. So, and then 15% of executions in purple. I mean, sorry, for 15% of the videos in purple are about ISIS executions, showing explicit executions of citizens. In fact, more than 1,250 citizens have been assassinated in front of the cameras of ISIS in the last 2 years. So how ISIS is framing... How ISIS is framing their messages? The most common audiovisual frame is based in the most popular video games, films, and music video clips of the Western audiences. In fact, 17% of ISIS videos are inspired directly on those cultural elements. In the case of videos showing executions, this number rises to 50%. So terror and brutality is not presented as a disgusting element, but as an attractive, fashionable, popular, and imitable cultural product. We can hear some examples. For example, I mean, just copying the most famous video games, or copying the same scenes as the most famous and popular films in the market, or again video games. I mean, they are in most of the battles, they put the Mujahideens GoPro cameras in order when they edit the video together, it really looks like Call of Duty. So they are talking the same language of their potential audiences. So how do they connect with their audiences? As we have seen, is talking with them into the same cultural language. So they are millennials talking to millennials. Second, talking in the same mother language. The most used language in ISIS videos is Arabic, 87%. So this really shows that the main potential target is people from Arab countries. But 13% of ISIS videos are in foreign languages, 33% in English, 24% in Russian, 22% in French. I mean, this also shows which are the audiences. And finally, and I conclude with this, they are talking to these audiences directly using the most popular channels of communication in social media. ISIS communication strategy is not hidden. On the contrary, they use constantly the most and well-known social media platforms to release their messages. It is fair to say that some of these campaigns, some of these companies are working harder and harder in order to delete and erase ISIS messages. But much more could be done. For instance, today, all the 1,026 videos released by ISIS are easily accessible at the internet. And also today, 2 years after ISIS started their digital communication campaign, the terrorists still releasing without any major problems between 2 and 3 campaigns per day, using the most popular social media tools. In fact, now, while we are talking here, the Ulayat of Salah al-Din is releasing a video in the most common social platforms without any problem, just while we are talking here. I want to end with a final remark, and it's also an open question for all of us. Is it possible to prevent and avoid totally the use of internet and social media by terrorist groups? Is it possible to design a digital proactive communication strategy capable of competing with ISIS messages on social media and win the minds and hearts of the most vulnerable young people? Maybe in the answer of those 2 questions, we could find important answers to face this challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a detailed qualitative and quantitative analysis of media strategies of the ISIS. And we have actually run out of time, but I'm going to take 3 or 4 comment interventions from the floor, keep them brief so that we can come back to the panelists for their responses. Gentlemen, please identify yourself and please pose a question.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jan Kleijsen. I'm Director at the Council of Europe. I'll have the opportunity to speak to you in another panel on international cooperation. On this panel, I have 2 short comments. First, I think it's made it abundantly clear that it will be necessary to work very closely with companies in order to tackle this threat. And a second comment. ISIS, Islamic State, it is neither Islamic nor a state. Why do we continue to use this term? Would it not be much better to use Daesh with its negative connotation of bigotry rather than give them the pleasure of being referred to as a state? Thank you.
Lady there.
From UNESCO. I'm a program specialist on internet governance. I fully agree with our panelists, particularly the one from the OSCE. We should go beyond the protection paradigm when we talk about empowering young people. UNESCO has convened an international conference in June about combating radicalization on internet with young people. We really found that the free-flow information enables pluralistic information, which allows people to identify propaganda for violence and war, and to recognize what source information are credible, eventually help them to choose a peaceful alternative. And we have a strong program of media information literacy, aiming to educate young people with a very wide range of literacies, including the gender sensitivity, including intercultural tolerance and the dialogue, including understanding of their rights and responsibilities, and also as ethics dimensions. We reach all, including our global citizenship education, which eventually will empower and help our young people with resilience, online competence, and eventually to resist and counter radicalization on internet. Thank you.
Thank you. Just last 2 comments, the gentleman here and then the lady there, please.
Hello. I'm a professor that came from Japan, and as an educator, I'm very much interested in the notion of the proactive message or positive message or light message that many of the panelists made. And my question is, do we know enough what that positive message should be? And as Professor Douzet said, do we know enough how, why the youngsters are so receptive to this message? And unless we know that, much deeper, we probably won't be able to
we'll have a panel on that this afternoon.
Okay.
On exactly this theme. The lady, please.
I'm a law professor at the University of Edinburgh, and I work with a number of civil society organisations in the UK, digital rights organisations. So when I listened to the last 2 sessions, what intrigued me about this was the use of the word terrorist that we are currently using. Because we're using the very universal term terrorist, but we're actually only talking at the moment about Islamic terrorism. And I think that might be something we may have to revisit to this extent, because we are essentially talking about the infrastructures and the authorizations we need to put in place to deal with terrorism, but we are currently only applying them to one particular form of terrorism, and I think there is a certain issue with that. So the question I have with that, in a way, is really, are we going to do this on the basis of, Justice Potter's, I know it when I see it kind of maxim, or do we need to have a better definition? And I know the UN has been working in this area for a while. But the other thing also is where do we draw the line, I think. So there is a question of, I've got a Tumblr, and the current posts that I've seen on my Tumblr in a completely unrelated field, lots and lots of very young people. And Islam is basically mentioned a lot of the time in the US, particularly when it comes round with messages about, please help us, we are currently being harassed here, we are currently doing this sort of stuff. So would messages of that kind actually then be affected in that sort of thing? So I think the idea of free speech and where do we draw the line, and if we monitor, block, filter, what kind of messages fall into that sort of system is something else we need to think about. And I think finally the other issue about the general idea of terrorism is, how do we deal with, shall we say, recently rehabilitated terrorist organizations? If we are putting in place very generalist or general infrastructures and general authorizations, how do we look at things like Sinn Féin in Ireland, which is now actually part of the government, the ANC in South Africa, which is now the government? We have seen terrorist organizations.
I'll have to interrupt you because we are running out of time.
Okay, thank
Thanks. So let me now go in the reverse order. Javier, do you want to come in first and respond to? You can pick and choose what you want to respond to.
Yeah, regarding the ISIS, the naming, well, Daesh, as you might know, it's Islamic State in Arabic. So at the end, we are saying Islamic State, but in Arabic. And I mean, at some point, I agree with you. In fact, I mean, if it's not Islamic, it's not an official state. I mean, only 2% of the videos that I saw, that I did the research, talk about religion. I mean, they are not engaging people with religion. That's completely true. But I think that in meetings like this one, that we have to choose a name to get understood each other. I mean, it's a matter of being practical. And I mean, that's my view, but I completely agree at the end of your reflection. Yeah.
Daniel?
On the naming, first of all, what is it? We don't really know. If the definition that I use, it's a proto-state, it's a global ideological movement, and a terror organization. All three of them together. But because of their control of the territories, and there is a tension because we don't really know what is going on there, mostly by what they let us out, showing in videos and in banners and pictures. So we need, I think, if we don't want to call them like a state, we need to provide tools, anonymity tools, to people that are on right, to civil rights people that are in Syria and Iraq now, to show the real reality over there. We also need maybe to go to the refugees that are now fled into Europe and get from them more information, more pictures, more stories that we can reveal, and to show that it's not a real state. Because for now, we see, as we saw in the video, we see them with nursing homes, with other things that are like symbols of a state.
No, sorry. Let me go to Jarko now for his comment.
Okay, first of all, thank you for all your questions. Yeah, just related to the question from UNESCO, yeah, I fully agree. Especially focusing on vulnerable groups like youth. So the internet literacy of youth, that is very important, and OSCE is also working on that. Then there was a question about do we know what these positive messages are? I think we have a lot of information about what these positive messages are, but I think the question of credibility, who should address them, or who, and then how to do it. And then we come to resources. We have been talking about the role of civil society and private sector, but very often then we are, let's say, we don't have the resources to do it. So I don't have any let's say, golden bullet in this, but anyway, I think we know a lot, and only what I mentioned in my recommendation, that we should just define precisely and narrowly the scope of our actions, and then focus on that with necessary resources. And the public-private partnerships is very important. Thank you.
Finally, your thoughts.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions, and thank you to my panelists and the moderator. I think we have to address the big social issues that the youth is confronting today. I mean, 50% of unemployment within our youth. We have major income disparity where globally 85 people have more income than 70% of the people in this world. We have serious human rights issues. So I think positive messaging is really critical, but I do think we have to address these big social issues so people aren't attracted to a group like ISIL. So that's something I hope we do, and we do globally. And I think we need to learn something from their media approach. They're loosely connected groups doing a lot of media outreach, and we always think we need to do it, or UN has to do it, or government has to do it. And I go back to the light web. We have to mobilize globally the youth to counteract it. That's really what we can do, and I think its impact is huge because there's just a small percentage of people who support ISIL, a very tiny, tiny percentage, and there's that 99.9% that doesn't. Why can't we tap into them and tap into that youth and get them energized? And I think that would be very helpful as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not even going to attempt to present some takeaways from this very interesting discussion, but let me just take a line out of Yarko's presentation of the OAC and pose ourselves one simple question, that it's quite clear these terrorist groups have cracked some sort of a code to reach out to some sort of constituencies in some sort of ways using technologies, messaging, communications, etc. So the question for us should be that, do we have a message to counter it? Have we in our minds narrowed or targeted an audience that we want to take this message to? Do we have a credible voice that can engage with them? And do we have the will to change some of the realities that can sometimes aggravate the situations and make the case tougher for all of us? With that, let me invite you to applaud the panel for their interventions. Thank you very much. We will now move to the next session, which will be on privacy and freedom of expression in the digital age. Thank you. Sorry I had to interrupt. I'm feeling very bad. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I call you? We have to initiate this, to start the session, please. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming back to your chair. Thank you. Could we start now? Thank you. I think that everybody is here. Okay. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, during this session we will focus on the need to promote and protect the right to privacy and freedom of expression in the digital age, in the current debate of preventing violent extremists from exploiting the internet and social media for terrorist acts. Effectively addressing concerns related to privacy and freedom of expression in the context of information communication technologies requires an ongoing multi-stakeholders approach. We have with us a diverse group of panelists to provide updates on these challenges, which should pave the way for a well-informed and very interesting discussion. I would like to remind our panelists to please limit the presentation to 8 minutes. An additional information, translation ends at 1 p.m. So please, for the people who would like to take the floor after the panelists, could you kindly take the floor in English? It will be so our presentation. The presentation will be followed by an open discussion. Interventions from the floor should be limited to 2 minutes. There is a good chance we can't take all comments, questions, given the lack of time. Please note that statements can be uploaded on the CTED website. J'ai le plaisir maintenant.
I have the pleasure now of introducing the Chief Prosecutor of Paris, Mr. François Molin. Given what's happened with the terrorist attacks that struck Paris on the 13th of November, we should welcome the action taken by the Chief Prosecutor of Paris, whose face appeared on every television screen, not only in France and Europe, but around the world. And on the procedures that he's in charge of, there's a great deal of hope that is placed upon him. So, Mr. Prosecutor, you have the floor.
C'est à moi.
Oui, Monsieur le Procureur, je viens de vous
Can you hear me? Yes. Moderator and Moderator. Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm very honored to be able to speak to you today. And I would like to speak very quickly about the effects of the Internet and also take stock of the situation in France today and raise the problem of telephone crypting. We know that the Internet and social media have increased the methods to radicalize and to recruit terrorists. Discussion forums have increased since 2001, and we know as well that the goals that are sought by these sites are, first of all, the radicalization, and it's a matter of leading a certain number of individuals to break with their families, schools, and workplace, thanks to maneuvers of psychological destabilization that aim to attain an unconditional allegiance. So these propaganda sites strive to develop a feeling of belonging to a community which is pure and which is above the rest of the world. And in fact, it's a matter of convincing them that they belong to a sacred group and to attract them with this illusion of power along with the propaganda. They recruit and also exchange operational information which could deal with the choice of target, the development of attack projects, the connections to reach Iraq and Syria, and finally, financial support, which is provided to jihadist terrorists. And it also makes it possible to exchange information between jihadists who are in the combat zones and those who are leaving or who have remained in their country. In fact, it's true that these pro-jihadist sites and their forums have become tools which have made it possible for all of these individuals to establish links, virtual links, without knowing each other, without actually meeting physically, and it could help them deploy terrorist activities. So what is the situation in France today? The figures that I'll give you go back to last Monday. The French intelligence services followed 1,905 people. So people who are considered to have involvement in the jihadist Iraqo-Syrian conflict. In Paris, we have today, in our judicial investigation procedure, 672 people, 692 people, more than 200 of them were indicted by magistrates, and more than 438 to be exact, who are sought, who are wanted, and who very often are en route to Iraq or Syria, and who are being sought on the basis of arrest warrants or search warrants. I would also like to say, in connection with the subject of the freedom of expression as well as the repression of those terrorist activities, I would like to say how difficult it is for us, difficulties that are linked to difficulties that we find in our investigations, difficulties that are linked to the use of the latest generation smartphones as well as crypting software, because all of this made it possible for those jihadist terrorists to continue their recruitment and also to prepare to commit terrorist acts. And we pointed out with Cyrus Vance from New York and Javier Zaragoza, who's the national prosecutor in Spain, who's in charge of the terrorist branch, and Adrien Labart, the head of police of London. We set up a forum which was published on the 2nd February in the New York Times, which says that with the in the encrypting of phones, there's an obstacle to justice. Through this article, we have something in common. We all belong to democracies where the rule of law guarantees the exercise of fundamental freedoms, among which there is the individual freedom, the right of assembly, the right to expression, the right to dignity, and the right to privacy. We belong to democracies that define the possibilities of instruments, the limits of instruments given to public authorities that violate privacy, because these attacks have to be proportional to the seriousness of the facts so that they would be legitimate. These violations of privacy in our countries are the exclusive jurisdiction of the judge, who alone can authorize it, because in our democratic systems based on the separation of powers, the judge is the protector or guardian of individual freedoms. If we look at the French Constitution, we see this in Article 66. It's also found in the European Convention on Human Rights in Article 10, reaffirming this right to the freedom of expression and the freedom of opinion, and pointing out that the exercise of those freedoms could be subject to certain formalities, conditions, restrictions, or sanctions called for by the law, which are necessary measures in a democratic society, necessary to defend law and order and to prevent crime. And thus, the private home cannot be violated, but in the judicial investigation, the judge can order a search. Every citizen must respect have his privacy respected, as well as his correspondence, but the judge in an investigation based on a serious violation can authorize telephone interceptions, and the same applies for private homes or vehicles. And this is up to the judge, because in the balance of powers, he is the one who is the guardian of individual freedoms. That's his mission. That's his very mandate. And I stress this because there's a substantial difference between the judge and operators or providers of services who use the operational networks like OTT. Today, operators and providers of these services tell us we are very concerned about the privacy of our clients, and that's what leads them to decide to no longer have access to the two-figure keys, which prevents them from giving this to the judicial authorities. Now, being concerned about the privacy is a very praiseworthy intention, but we have to note that this is not an institutional position, and it is a commercial or a trade policy which could change or be changed if tomorrow the search for a profit leads to a different policy based on other options. Now, that's the difference with the public authorities, the judges who are in charge of security and freedom for citizens. If there's no security, there's no freedom. And in a democracy, I was saying, the respect for freedoms comes under the office of the judge, and there is no better protection against arbitrary actions. We have said that the new smartphones made justice blind. What is the situation today in France? We know that every telephone or a tablet can be either locked with a code with 4 or 5 figures by a diagram or by biometrics, and it could be encrypted in a very complex way. Today in France, the tools that are used by the technical services of the French administration are ineffective for the most recent apparatuses, BlackBerry, Windows 10, iPhone 5 and higher, which has a code, locking by code or fingerprints. And today, we don't have any solution to have access to an encrypted device. Now, at the central direction of the judicial police, which is one of the services that fights against terrorism and organized crime, in 2014, there were 6 telephones and 8 telephones in 2015 that are no longer accessible to investigators. In a terrorist case against an individual who was named Sida Menplen, who last April wanted to attack a church with a Kalashnikov rifle and kill Christians close to Paris, we found a telephone in which we still have we haven't been able to hack that phone 6 months after the arrest. And in all of our investigations, all of the telephones that are used by Daesh terrorists are locked and encrypted. This favors the secrecy of communication as well as the preparation of any action. The use of encrypting software of the PGP type is regularly seen as well in the files of organized crime. The main consequences of that phenomenon is to make investigators blind to this, and who must try to compensate for this by taking other approaches, other investigations when they are possible, but it's not always the case. And they often come across great difficulties, and it's often impossible for them to approach certain criminal groups, and an arrangement of investigations to bring together evidence. And when the only possible evidence is in the telephone, and since you cannot have access to this, investigations cannot make any more progress. And so today it's a fact, and I'm speaking with full knowledge of the procedures in Paris, that the encrypting systems allow terrorists to communicate today with impunity. The judicial action is coming up against 2 major difficulties today. This is the French point of view. The first is the extraterritoriality of data and servers, because the over-the-top services are based abroad in the United States, namely, which implies a necessary cooperation of several states. The second difficulty that they come across is the encrypting of support that makes it difficult to carry out an investigation. Nothing today, even the OTT service provider, nothing forces them to give the encrypting code, as the case in France and in the United States as well, where nothing is opposed to this in the U.S. Constitution. We think this should be imposed. The threat posed by Daesh and Al-Qaeda is global in nature. It's already, as we know, led to several Security Council resolutions to try to pave the way for all member states. And the UN, I believe, is a perfect place of balance between these values, and which makes it possible to find a solution. The problem posed by this encrypting is global, and it can never be resolved at the level of a single country. I believe it calls for a global response, which is based on a balance between the protection of privacy and the possibility for judicial authorities to prevent crimes, to solve them, and to prosecute and punish the perpetrators. This could be done through a technical solution in a country where data would be collected by a national operator. I'm not an expert in this area, but this also means that we have to provide decrypting keys whenever in a judicial investigation a judge has ordered it. And this also means, and I think this is crucial, that we have to have a better definition in every national legislation of the idea of electronic communication, because we realize that according to the country, the idea of electronic communication changes. It's not defined in the same way, and this also means a better definition in every legislation of the idea of electronic communication, which could include all of the services involved in distributing communication services via electronic means. And when we harmonize this legislation, and when we have a global discussion on this problem, that way we will be able to move forward in resolving and finding solutions before we find ourselves up against major difficulties, which could be very harmful to the community of every country, but also the international community. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur le Procureur.
Thank you, Prosecutor. Your briefing was very thorough, and it gave us an excellent approach as to how, as the Chief Prosecutor of Paris, you are tackling this matter of the proportional use of the Internet and social media for terrorist purposes. And you've also stressed the importance of the guarantee of fundamental freedoms by democratic states, as well as the importance of international cooperation in order to better tackle these issues that are raised by the Internet for terrorist purposes. Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Mr. David Kay, who is the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you to the Counterterrorism Committee for inviting me to this important meeting. I found the contributions from the earlier panels and from the most recent presenter to be extremely enlightening. And I need to say at the outset that I apologize that I have to leave early to catch a flight. I share the view that combating terrorism is a critical responsibility of the Security Council, of member states, and other authorities. We have already heard today about the sophistication terrorists bring to bear on their online use, in part because they're largely young, or younger than many of us, and like other youth worldwide, they've grown up with the Internet and social media. In the brief time that I have, I want to lay out 5 points that I hope will orient us as a matter of global values embedded in human rights law, and perhaps allow us to take a step back and think about not only terrorism, but also how to protect and promote the Internet's broad value as a tool for public participation, accountability, individual development, and much more. So, one, I've been really quite pleased at the level of nuance in the panels this morning. Outside this room, it is common to hear discussion of the Internet as a threat, a vast arena that terrorists manipulate and seemingly control. They do not control it, of course. The global reach of the net the vast amount of information that it allows everyone to access who is not under a regime of censorship, the communication it allows, can be a tool to counter extremism that results in violence. And I think thinking about the internet not only as a threat from the terrorist perspective, but also a resource for de-radicalization and counter-extremism is critical. 2, for my part, I need to see data. The discussion today, as framed by the concept note, presupposes that many, if not most, terrorists radicalize online. But as earlier panelists suggested, this is likely not true, or at least as the George Washington University paper that was presented earlier noted, radicalization does take place online, but the roots of radicalization, its causes, they're diverse, and they vary from case to case, and online space may only be a small part of the process. Recent high-profile tragedies, for example, the Paris and the San Bernardino killings, the Boston Marathon bombers, these involved siblings or spouses who almost certainly radicalized each other face to face. You can go back to 9/11 and earlier to see complicated patterns of radicalization. Simply put, the internet is in all likelihood not the main problem, although clearly use of online tools can be. 3, let me say a few words really about the core reason I think I'm on the panel, and that is to talk about legal framework. Most, but not all countries are party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and I think that provides the framework for our discussion. And it's well known that Article 19 of the ICCPR protects everyone's right to hold opinions without interference, and everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. I want to emphasize this last point as a question was raised during the first panel about whether freedom of expression and Article 19 in particular was developed in a previous century and may need to be somehow revised, or the question at least was posed. But I think that Article 19 actually seems to predict the existence of the internet in a way by emphasizing that the rights apply regardless of frontiers and through any media. Restrictions on opinion are not permissible, whereas restrictions on expression must be provided by law and be necessary to protect a legitimate specified government objective such as national security, public order, and so forth. Any restrictions that are designed to prevent terrorism must be necessary and proportionate to achieve that aim. The proportionality requirement actually need not be seen solely as a constraint. It also allows, indeed it requires, a framework for ensuring that restrictions on terrorist content and communication do not undermine everyone's right to access information and the existence of civic space, which could indeed have a counterproductive effect itself. 4, censorship and other forms of content regulation. And here I want to make 2 subpoints. First, as much as I understand the need to target recruitment, financing, and incitement activities by terrorist groups, I'm also concerned that the umbrella of counterterrorism and national security will be used to restrict all sorts of legitimate expression under human rights law. We already see the expansion of restrictions on these grounds. Second, but related, it is critical that restrictions be necessary and that governments and corporate actors not restrict information that may in fact have a de-radicalizing impact. Indeed, even the most awful videos online may have the impact of repelling potential recruits, and so there does need to be some caution. And last, 5, there has been some discussion this morning and just now about encryption, and it comes up regularly in public debate. Local law enforcement focus on device encryption or data at rest generally, while national level and intelligence officials often talk about data in transit, such as conversations or messaging in real time. I've reported to the Human Rights Council on this topic and on anonymity, and I want to emphasize 2 or 3 points. 1, we need to have a broad and realistic concept of security. one that's responsive not only to terrorism, but to identity theft, digital attacks, harassment, and much else that can harm individual livelihood and well-being, and everyone's ability to exercise rights to freedom of opinion and expression. And at the center of such protection online is, in fact, encryption, the ability of individuals to secure their data, their identity, their connections, their relationships. Second, encryption is simply math, and it's open source by and large. So efforts to undermine encryption in one place, say smartphones or messaging applications, may do more to harm regular individuals than to disable terrorists who can easily find ways to circumvent restrictions. And insecurity in one place generally leads to insecurity across networks. In other words, undermining encryption may in fact do very little to prevent terrorist activity, but disproportionately interferes with individual expression, communication, and access to information. The final point that I want to make is that these are issues of public policy. Restrictions on encryption, for example, in the smartphone discussion, or for end-to-end encryption around different applications, such as Apple's or Google's applications, are matters of public policy. It is not for government simply to go into a back room with the corporate sector and find solutions. I urge that there be transparency and that all of these issues be resolved as a matter of law and public policy. So I'll conclude by saying that events like this, events that integrate human rights and security, that bring into the conversation a variety of stakeholders, are really critical as we all move forward. And moving forward, I'm happy to and hope to participate in them further. Thank you very much.
Merci, David.
Thank you, David. You once again stress the importance of a proportional approach being measured in our approach to these issues, which raise questions of human rights in terms of freedom of expression and fundamental freedoms and safeguards. I think this is in line with the previous speakers. You also stressed the importance of seeing the internet and social networks as a positive element and not just have a negative approach in terms of the violations of human rights. This is a good thing. It's good coming from the Rapporteur. And you've also stressed, finally, as the previous speaker did, the importance of international cooperation and thus the importance that the Security Council and this body here deals with this issue to find solutions, as we have been called upon to do so by Mr. Laborde in his introductory statement. These must be effective, rapid, and immediate and positive solutions. The next speaker is Lynn Descaries. You are the General Counsel from the Federal Public Prosecution Service in Quebec, Canada. Mrs. Descaries, you have the floor. Thank you.
Actually, I'll be addressing 4 different points. First of all is how human rights are respected in Canadian legislation, so what we have in place. The second point is, have our courts been dealing with the cyber world? After that, I will be talking about what some people refer to as the offense of incitement. And lastly, as a prosecutor that deals with these cases, advising the police and also prosecuting in court, the role that has played internet and internet communications in what they call the foreign terrorist fighters. We call them high-risk travelers. There's different expressions. So first of all, how human rights are respected in Canadian legislation is pursuant actually to Section 4.1 of the Department of Justice Act. The Minister of Justice must verify compliance with the Charter of Rights of all legislation. So it's not because it's legislation dealing with terrorism. For all legislation, he must certify compliance. And how does he do this? When they are elaborating the laws, they're regularly consulting also with human rights lawyers. And on certain, for certain laws, actually, there have been changes, tweaks, stuff added right until the last minute. Now, once it becomes law, what can happen afterwards? Well, afterwards, it's the courts that deal with it. Anyone who's charged with one of the sections of the criminal code can actually challenge the section itself by saying it's unconstitutional. It goes against my right, my freedom of expression. And we have one example, I think, which is interesting, is one individual that was charged with multiple terrorism-related offenses, was charged also with participating and facilitating. And what he had done mostly is he had prepared and worked on and put online all kinds of videos inciting to jihad and how to do this and how to do that. Well, he actually challenged and he said, well, you know, these sections of the criminal code and also the definition of terrorist activity in the Canadian criminal code goes against my freedom of expression. So whenever someone brings such a motion, it's we rely on our judges. And there's actually, and it's not a simple process, it's actually a complex process that the judge must go through. And in this case, it was decided that both sections, the participating in terrorist activity, facilitating, and the definition, were constitutional. So it's, I'm glad to say that it has been tested. Now, second of all, have our courts been dealing with the cyber world? I can tell you that in the last few years, and our Supreme Court has definitely addressed the issue. What we have to realize is that computers and electronic devices are extremely different from the good old days of finding a box, a document, opening a drawer. So you cannot compare ordinary searches. So we had all this jurisprudence on search law, but you can't compare ordinary searches to searches of electronic devices. And why? Because the courts have decided, first of all, because of the vast amount of data, all the personal information also that can be in these computers or any electronic devices. And it's even gone on to not necessarily the ones that are owned by the person. A lot of people are using devices that are supplied by their employers. So we've even had, so the expectation of privacy, some people would have thought, well, of course, if it's your work computer or your work phone, you've got no expectation of privacy. Well, our courts have said, whoa, actually, there is an expectation of privacy. So that's what I mean. So, and this is still developing. But for example, you need to have, when police seize, for example, electronic devices, it doesn't mean that they can just search as far as they can into those. They actually need a separate authority. They need a judge, they need to go back to a judge and to say, okay, well, I've seized this computer, this phone, now I'd like to search it, and why, and to what extent. So that's an example. Another one is that we, when they do a search incidental to arrest, I mean, who here doesn't have an electronic device on them, whether it's a USB key, your iPhone, whatsoever. Now, it has been maintained that they can seize things incidental to arrest, but it doesn't mean that they can look into it and do these full-on searches. There's certain conditions that apply. And I'm just going to go over them, but I'm just saying that the courts have addressed this. Now, the expectation of privacy is always an important factor in these. Now, as for incitement, we actually in Canada don't have the crime of incitement. We have instructing, we have recruiting, which is within participating in terrorist activity. We've got facilitating terrorist activity. And all of these, by the way, there's been constitutional challenge and they've withstood them. In 2013, we have got 4 new charges, which are extremely relevant to these, what we call the FTFs, is leaving or attempting to leave Canada in order to either participate in terrorist activity, facilitate, to commit offenses in association with a terrorist group. So these are these 4 new offenses that we had. And in just lately, actually, in 2015, we didn't have the new charge we have is called advocating or promoting. Now, this is not the same thing. We believe that inciting has a higher threshold for mens rea. So this advocating and promoting, so far we have not had any cases, so it has not been challenged. but it has been based on our hate crime propaganda. So there's similarities there. What happens, though, is that often the conduct of the individual falls under another section. So, like I said, we will see with time, but I was asked the question, when does a statement become an advocation or a promotion of something? Well, of course, you know what? It just doesn't just depend on words. And I think what's really important to stress here is the context. We have to look at the entire context. So it's not just saying, well, the person tweeted these or retweeted these 3 words or transmitted such a message. We're going to have to look at, and this is me and my colleagues, when these cases are submitted to us, at the entire context. And one of the safeguards also we have, I just want to say, in any charges of terrorism in Canada, is you need the approval of the Attorney General. So that gives it sort of like another layer of safeguard. And if there's situations sometimes that don't amount to charges, I also want to say that we do have in our criminal code a section which permits us to use preventive measures, which is getting peace bonds for some of these people where we've got reason to believe but we don't have enough to charge. We have reason to believe that they will commit terrorism offenses. And a lot of times some of the conditions that are imposed there are actually limiting or stopping the access to internet or to cellular phones, putting GPS bracelets on them, that sort of stuff. And just, I see time's up, so I'm just going to wrap it up in a minute, is the role that plays internet communications in these cases, huge, I can tell you. I'm presently advising on quite a few of these investigations, and I am in court right now presenting these cases. We're actually going to get a verdict tomorrow in our first case of a young offender charged with attempting to leave Canada. And in all of these cases, what I have noticed, a big part of our evidence is what we find in their computers, is the communications they've had with other people. And we show, for example, and one thing I've noticed from one case to another is they are actually often accessing the same videos, the same communiques, what they download, what they've accessed, what they're sending off to the next person. And we've also been able to establish links between people that we have no idea. This young person we thought was someone of a lone wolf. Well, when we were able to get access to his Twitter communications, we realized he had actually been in touch with one of the individuals in Canada who had committed a terrorist act in October of 2014, and that he was in touch with someone that we know who's very active in Syria. Well, if it hadn't been for those Twitter communications, which, by the way, we didn't get with an MLAT, we were lucky enough that there was another police force of another country that gave it to us, because I'm not sure, because like we said before, MLAT is a problem because it takes a long time. So the challenges are the amount of data to analyze. Sometimes we've got very, very short time to react. Sometimes also, and other people have mentioned it, there's certain devices we cannot access, and we have problems with that, and I'm hoping to see that develop. And so I just encourage international cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. The other challenge is turning intelligence into evidence, and to try to, I think the message here is to work together in this field. Thank you very much. Merci, madame.
Thank you, Lynn. It has been very interesting to listen to you and to understand how, in your capacity of Procureur Fédéral, you are addressing the question of fighting internet, using internet also in your investigation and your work. So thank you very much. The importance of the protection and promotion of human rights is quite important. Mm-hmm. And you underline also the importance of international cooperation in your efforts. So our fourth panelist will be Judith Lichtenberg. You are Executive Director of the Global Network Initiative. So Judith, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Today I would like to focus on some of the ways in which recently adopted or proposed counter-terrorism laws and policies impact rights to freedom of expression and privacy. Before I do so, let me say a word or two about the Global Network Initiative. GNI is a multi-stakeholder organization. We bring together ICT companies with academia, investors, and human rights and press freedom groups, such as Human Rights Watch and the Committee to Protect Journalists, to forge a common approach to freedom of expression and privacy. Our members sign up to a set of principles and implementation guidelines that are based on internationally recognized human rights standards, and they inform responsible decision-making when companies face government requests that could impact the freedom of expression and privacy rights of their users. Our company members include Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Let me start by saying that GNI acknowledges the legitimate national security and law enforcement objectives of states and also the need to protect public. But we are very concerned that the rush to adopt laws and policies aimed at increasing restriction of content and government access to communication data not only may be ineffective to combat terrorism, but may also have serious negative consequences for freedom of expression and privacy. Let me start with freedom of expression. Consistent with UN Security Council resolutions, states have passed and updated laws providing for the restriction of content online that allegedly constitutes the incitement, glorification, or promotion of terrorism. But there continues to be no internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism, and states have adopted broad definitions of the speech that is prohibited. And meanwhile, across the world, counter-terrorism laws are used to monitor, intimidate and imprison journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers and political opponents. There have also been calls to ICT companies to police user content and communications that allegedly incite, glorify or promote terrorism under threat of greater liability. These policies chill freedom of expression. They incentivize carriers to use or to restrict the use of their services for any content that could be considered controversial. We are also concerned about the increasing pressure on companies by governments to collaborate in ways that do not appear to be based in law and are not transparent or accountable to public. Some governments have tried to influence the content policies of these ICT companies and to use these policies to secure the removal of content through informal mechanisms wholly outside the legal system. To address these issues and to foster a multi-stakeholder approach, GNI has launched a global policy dialogue on this issue through roundtable discussions and public events. We are developing a set of best practices as to how governments and companies can address extremist content online. And so far, what we have noted is a need for additional research to identify links between the interaction with extremist content online and radicalization of individuals. And I fully support what David Kay has said on this issue. On his second point, our stakeholder participants also agree that radicalization is a very complex phenomenon which cannot be attributed alone with the interaction with extremist content online. And there is also evidence that suggests that further restricting this content actually drives people to communicate in ways that are less visible to the authorities. Stakeholders also agree, what we have heard earlier today, that we need more credible and visible counter-narratives, but their roles should be better understood and supported. Journalists are an important part of this effort, but only if they can do their job freely and independently. With regard to privacy, GNI is concerned that recent laws and proposals to increase communication surveillance do not meet the standards of legality, necessity, and proportionality. Bulk collection of both content and metadata undermines the security of electronic communication services provided by companies. This includes the bulk collection by states and the mandates to companies and third parties to store data. Government surveillance programs should be targeted, be based on individual suspicion, and have independent judicial oversight. We are also concerned by government practices and proposals to undermine the digital security of individuals to pursue enforcement law objectives. States should use transparent legal processes to make requests of companies that secure and store their users' data. If requests are across jurisdictions, government should rely on mutual legal assistance processes or other international frameworks with human rights protections. We acknowledge, and it has been said here today as well, that the MLAT is in need of reform. We have seen that because it doesn't function properly, governments sometimes resort to extra legal and unilateral actions to obtain data, and those actions may be harmful for a free, secure, and open internet. And so for this reason, states should cooperate to forge an international framework that is transparent and accountable, that supports public safety by facilitating timely access to cross-border data while increasing individual privacy protections. GNI has commissioned a report on MLA reform earlier this year, and we are part of a dialogue with the industry sector and civil society actors to develop further reform proposals, including how an international framework for cross-border data sharing could look like. To conclude, efforts to fight radicalization and terrorism are most effective when they are evidence-based, when they support open and free societies, and when they are developed in cooperation with governments, companies, law enforcement, and civil society actors. So GNI will continue to encourage governments and international organizations to broadly consult affected stakeholders, experts, and the public to find solutions that generally protect public safety and uphold human rights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Judith. You have rightly underlined the importance of cooperation between the public and private sector, and the importance to find also, in the framework of the international cooperation, new modalities to reinforce guarantee to privacy and human rights. This is quite important. Just an information to, as announced at the very beginning of our session, translation ends at 1 p.m. So I have to announce that the interpreters are released. Thank you, and sorry for that. Now our last speaker is Emma Lanzo. Emma Lanzo, you have graduated from your Yale Law School, and you joined the Center for Democracy and Technology. So you are the director of the Center's Freedom of Expression project. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, and thank you to our hosts for the opportunity to speak with you all today. My name is Emma Alonzo, and I'm from the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a nonprofit public interest advocacy organization that seeks to promote human rights in internet policy. And while many important issues have been raised today, and I particularly would like to support the Special Rapporteur's comments on the importance of encryption to security and freedom of expression online, I wanted to focus my comments today on highlighting the risks to privacy and freedom of expression from efforts to push regulation of online terrorist activity onto private companies. In recent weeks and months, there have been calls from political leaders around the world for internet companies to do more to combat the spread of radical ideologies online. Government officials have emphasized a desire for public-private partnerships, establishing initiatives and even calling on companies to change their terms of service, all seemingly aimed at the goal of seeing companies restrict more content online. In developing approaches to responding to terrorist propaganda, it's vital that we all do so from within the framework of essential protections from fundamental human rights that was laid out for us earlier. A good example of the sort of program that that raises some challenges, that highlights the risks and challenges raised by efforts to leverage private companies' enforcement mechanisms for content removal, are what are called Internet Referral Unit programs that are already underway in a number of states. These are programs by which law enforcement officers flag content that they wish to see removed from the web for review under a website's terms of service rather than pursuing formal legal action against the speech. This type of program raises a number of challenges under the human rights framework. A key fact to recall is that companies' privately developed terms of service and content policies are typically more restrictive and often much more restrictive than what governments may permissibly restrict under law. Further, these programs may not always be clearly articulated in law. The specific procedures and processes are often not communicated transparently with the public, and there has not been an evidence-based showing that they are necessary or effective. Typically, these programs do not provide a clear definition of prescribed content. As many speakers have said already today, there is no internationally agreed upon definition of extremist content. This results in delegation of setting those definitions to private actors. Under these programs, government officials seek content restriction with no review by a judge or under other independent authority, creating a circumvention of due process protections for freedom of expression. And thus, individuals whose speech or access to information are affected by these programs have no opportunity for redress. They have no access to a remedy or an opportunity to appeal these decisions, either with the government or often with the company. So this sort of program helps to demonstrate that there is a need for transparency and greater clarity from governments about their efforts to see content removed from the internet. Governments have the obligation under international human rights law to ensure that policies are articulated in law, are based in evidence, as my colleague Judith has discussed, that they are likely to achieve the compelling goal or interest of the state. Governments must provide a clear, understandable definition of what content or speech is to be restricted, and policy development processes should be open and participatory. Further, we see a real need for greater transparency from companies about how their content removal processes actually work. Very little information is available publicly about the scope and scale of content removal efforts of major internet companies, though we know that it happens every day and involves significant time and resource expenditure on their part. If policymakers are engaging companies in discussions of their roles in responding to terrorist propaganda, even on a voluntary or public-private partnership basis, we all, as interested and affected stakeholders, need to be able to discuss and evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. Because, it must be said, no company has a perfect record on content removal, even according to their own terms of service. All companies' review and moderation processes will be vulnerable to error. This is simply inevitable at the scale at which they operate. And policymakers must understand that there are a variety of types of content filtering with their own strengths and weaknesses, including automated processes where content is filtered based on keywords, other automated processes such as YouTube's Content ID or Microsoft's Photo DNA, where images or sound files are identified for removal based on comparison to a reference database of previously identified material. Most content moderation processes also involve some subjective assessment through human review of flagged content, a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. But regardless of the type of content removal process, there are potentials for error. On the one hand, because no filter is perfect, content that could or should be removed under terms of service may be missed and not removed. Now, if companies face potential legal sanction for failure to remove content, this type of potential error leads to overblocking of protected speech. This risk is why we have seen the wide recognition of the importance of legal protections from intermediary liability to freedom of expression online, including reports by the previous Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and UNESCO's Internet study from earlier this year. On the other hand, errors may be false positives, where content that does not violate terms of service, much less violate the law, is also removed. And here key questions have to be, what are the remedies for speakers who have been silenced? What else happens to a speaker and her personal information if she is erroneously identified as having expressed or been associated with online terrorist activity? So in conclusion, I'll just say that ultimately, vague, overbroad policies in this arena that shift too much responsibility onto private companies and remove procedural protections for fundamental rights create the risk of overbroad censorship and removal of lawful protected speech from the internet. We may also see results that are counterproductive to national security, and particularly anti-radicalization efforts, if people from certain ethnic groups, nationalities, or religions are targeted, either intentionally or inadvertently through algorithmic processes for greater scrutiny and censorship. Finally, overzealous efforts to pursue expedited, privatized content removal risk undermining the rule of law and the values of a democratic society. As we will be discussing later today, efforts in this arena really should focus on supporting opportunities for counter-speech, but any policy aimed at seeking the removal of content from the internet should be developed in an open, transparent, participatory process and should be based on evidence of efficacy as well as informed by technical and practical capabilities in order to ensure that human rights and fundamental freedoms are protected and respected. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I think that further to Judith, you did call us to have a multi-stakeholders approach and to have a balanced approach between public and private sector. I think that we don't have not a lot of time for the questions. Nevertheless, we could open now the session for questions. Russian Federation, you have the floor. 2 minutes. Thank you.
Am I right that we don't have any translation now? I have to speak English. Well, I'll speak Russian English, sorry for that. 2 brief comments. First of all, unfortunately, Special Rapporteur has left, and he gave his opinion that Internet probably is not a huge factor in as far as the issues we discuss are concerned. No, Russian side thinks that Internet and what is being spread around through Internet and social means is a huge factor promoting terrorist approaches, and we have to deal with it. And second, very brief comment is about the factor of time we have to take into consideration. Sometimes, including today, it seems that we are looking for an ideal solution, but I think that we have to find a solution and use it. Otherwise, probably even if it's not ideal, because time will play against us again, and the terrorist threat will increase and go to the heights we probably even don't think about now. So we have to be quick and fast enough and produce a solution. And probably Procureur de la République de Paris, he gave an example of this phone that was taken by law enforcement agencies, and for 7 months it wasn't opened, as experts say, dealing with these issues. It's not the way to deal promptly and fast enough with such situations. And again, the Russian side thinks that governments and government agencies and law enforcement agencies are to play the absolutely leading role in tackling these issues and in cooperating between each other. That's the way to deal with the threat of terrorism, and of course also through involving civil society and their potential. But the government should play the absolutely leading role, and that's the way to deal with it. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Roche. Any questions in the room? Yes.
I do understand your concerns about keeping this into an institutional framework and not shifting the power to decide on taking down content to private companies, and I think it's a very sensitive question, and we need serious criteria as far as what we consider as being problematic content that we need to take down. Now, taking it from a French perspective, all the social media that are involved in this discussion are based in the US, and the MLAT process is very long, and I understand it needs reform. The reform of the MLAT process is going to be very long. So in the meantime, what is the alternative to working directly with the platforms?
Who wants to answer? Any question? Is there a question in the room before asking the panelists to answer? Any comment?
First, very quick. First one is that I like to say that internet is a double-edged sword. There are negative dimensions, but it should not overshadow the positive ones, as we have discussed in the parallel meeting with this +10 review, which is really taking place at the same time. That we should not put in danger the internet. We should really consider the important contribution to the 2030 development agenda. That's a real context. Secondly, the American speaker has already touched upon the tension between free expression, privacy protection, and the action combating the terrorism. Yes, there's something, but I think that's a very delicate, complicated balance to strike. For that aim, that UNESCO has also conducted several researches. We have distributed some publications. One is on the role of internet intermediaries. We talk about the internet social media in search engine, and there share some good practice how the public, government, law enforcement work with company and to respect the human rights standard without compromising our security action. And the second research I share is about online hate speech. We also provide some legal and also social responses.
Thank you. Well, any other comment, question? Well, maybe we could come back to the panelists and any conclusion. Monsieur le Procureur, I'm sorry we don't have any more the translation, so I'm inviting you to take the floor.
I will try to speak English with bad English. I want to say two things. First, we began, I think, a good cooperation with providers, with Twitter, with Google, with some results. But I think that we are also a little prisoner of the goodwill of providers, and it cannot be a true solution. Second thing, I think that the problem is not to forbid the encryption. I did not say that. I think that encryption can have a important role in the protection of human rights. The problem is to keep the keys of encryption, and I think that to find a solution, lawmakers can prohibit the sale of digital devices that cannot be accessed pursuant to court orders. The problem is here, and not in the prohibition of encryption. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lynn, do you want to react?
I also, well, I agree, I think, with the intervention from Russia, is that the internet is actually playing quite a big role. And I'll tell you from the real cases that I see, because I look inside these young people's computers and I see what's on their phones and I see what they are accessing. And some of them are, someone had mentioned on an earlier one about, you know, they're alone in their room. And this is how they're being radicalized. It's not because they're attending a group or whatsoever. A lot of them, it's only through the internet, and they're by themselves in their bedroom accessing this. So I just wanted to say that I agree that it does play a big part. And I would also like to see, we're dealing often with urgent matters, and the whole process, and yes, the servers are based a lot of times in the United States or elsewhere, and I think we need to find a solution to get quicker access. And I know, as you say, the reform for the MLATs is also going to take a long time, but we need to address this. This is happening now. So those were my comments.
Judith, any comment?
Yes, I have 3 comments. First, on the role of the internet. we just want to emphasize, also along the lines what David Kay has said, is that there still is a lot not well understood about radicalization. And we definitely need more research into the motivations and underlying causes of radicalization. And it's really important to look into the links between online and offline. And sometimes we think that it is very clear, but research shows that it's not too clear. Secondly, in terms of timing, it both relates to the second comment of a Russian delegate and also about the comment on MLAT. We should not forget that law enforcement and intelligence services have already incredible powers on the basis of current laws. And so what we would like to emphasize is that don't fall into the trap in rushing to adopt new laws and policies where there is no evidence for their effectiveness. Thirdly, on MLAT. This problem has been known already for years. GNI has made a point of it for many years, and so it is sometimes disappointing to hear now that governments say, look, we don't have time to reform it. It is very important that governments start now as soon as possible to really start with those reforms, and they can also do a couple of measures to change it and make it more effective in the short term. I'm happy to share the report we commissioned earlier this year, which do very concrete proposals in that regard. Having said that, we are part of a dialogue to further develop proposals in the short term. But I guess that Emma can say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. Yes, and particularly to this question about what to do given that MLAT takes such time and there is this real sense of urgency. I do want to caution that, a bit as Judith has said, this is not the first time that the challenges or the shortcomings of the MLAT process have come up, and this is certainly not the first time that there have been questions around jurisdiction and content on the internet. And it is even in the current environment, even when we have such a focus on urgency around the topic we're here to discuss today, it is also important that at the same time we move forward this conversation on what are the legal frameworks that will work in the future. Because this, whether it's what to do about terrorist propaganda or hate speech or online harassment of women or a number of other topics, this question is not going away. And from my perspective, the concern I see, particularly with the emphasis on government and company interaction as the way to see content removed, is that I don't want to see us all become accustomed to government-initiated censorship, essentially, that happens purely through private mechanisms where there are none of the procedural protections, the due process protections for freedom of expression. So I think a key issue that needs to be addressed in any further discussions about this relation between governments and companies is what is the remedy? What is the way that speakers and those who access information are notified about content being removed from circulation, under what standards, and what remedies do people have if that content removal is not in accordance with the law and goes beyond what governments can or companies should be restricting. So I'd say that needs to be a key component of future discussions in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. It's very difficult to make a summary of this very rich debate and discussion. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, terrorists and their supporters should be held accountable when they commit the offense of incitement to terrorism, recruitment, training and planning and preparation of and financing of crimes when disseminated through ICT. At the same time, we should recall that the rights held by people offline must also be protected online. While the right to privacy under international human rights law is not absolute, an instance of interference must be subject to a careful and critical assessment of its necessity, legitimacy, and proportionality. It is therefore important for the success of any prosecution that investigative techniques be properly authorized under national laws and, as always, that supporting legislation respect fundamental human rights protected under international human rights law. And just to close this meeting with a little hope, let us have a message, listen to a message that has been given by our Director General, UNESCO Director General Irina Bokova, recently declared, we need to disarm the process of radicalization to undo the mechanisms of influence that can place young people on the path to violent extremism. We must teach peace. Thank you very much.